Death stands as the only universal human experience that no living person has ever truly experienced. This paradox defines our relationship with mortality. We know death with absolute certainty as our destination, yet we possess no direct knowledge of what it means to be dead. This creates what we might call the existential blind spot. We must think about something we cannot think our way into. Throughout human history, across every culture and intellectual tradition, thinkers have grappled with death not merely as a biological event, but as a philosophical problem. The arguments we will explore represent humanity's most sophisticated attempts to understand, cope with, or transcend the brute fact of our finitude. The way we think about death shapes how we live, what we value, who we love, and what we build. Consider your own death for a moment. Not the deaths of others, not death in general, but the specific annihilation of your consciousness, the permanent ending of your subjective experience. This thought likely produces discomfort, perhaps even a subtle anxiety you quickly push aside. This reaction itself is data. It tells us something profound about human consciousness. We are creatures who know we will die, and this knowledge does something to us. The arguments about death fall into several major categories. There are arguments about whether death harms us, and if so, how. There are arguments about whether we should fear death, welcome it, or remain indifferent. There are psychological arguments about how awareness of death shapes our behavior, often without our conscious knowledge. There are metaphysical arguments about what death means for personal identity and existence, and there are practical arguments about how to live in the shadow of mortality. What makes death philosophically fascinating is that it sits at the intersection of everything that matters: consciousness, time, value, meaning, love, and loss. To think clearly about death requires us to think clearly about life itself. The arguments we encounter will force us to confront uncomfortable questions. What makes life valuable? Can something harm you if you do not exist to experience the harm? Is the prospect of infinite life desirable or horrifying? Does the inevitability of death render our projects meaningless or give them urgency and weight? This exploration will not offer easy comfort or simple answers. Instead, it provides intellectual tools for thinking more clearly about the most significant fact of human existence. We will examine arguments that have endured for thousands of years alongside contemporary scientific and philosophical perspectives. We will see where these arguments succeed, where they fail, and what they reveal about the human condition. The stakes could not be higher. How we think about death influences medical ethics, public policy, personal relationships, and the very architecture of human culture. It affects how we grieve, how we age, what risks we take, and what legacies we pursue. Understanding these arguments means understanding something essential about what it means to be human. Part 1. The Harm Thesis and the Epicurean Challenge. The most fundamental question about death is deceptively simple. Is death bad for the person who dies? Your immediate response might be yes, obviously. Death seems like the worst thing that can happen to someone. But this intuition, however strong, faces a profound philosophical challenge that has occupied thinkers for over 2,000 years. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus constructed an argument that has become the foundation of all subsequent debate about the badness of death. His logic appears unassailable. Death is the permanent cessation of consciousness. When you are dead, you no longer exist. You have no experiences, no sensations, no awareness. Epicurus asks, how can something be bad for you when there is no you to be harmed? As he wrote, death is nothing to us, since when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. The two never meet. Therefore, death cannot harm the person who dies. This argument has enormous psychological implications. If Epicurus is correct, we waste vast amounts of emotional energy fearing something that cannot actually harm us. Our anxiety about death would be irrational, like fearing a villain who never arrives. We could live with tranquility, freed from what Epicurus saw as one of the greatest sources of human suffering, the terror of mortality. But the Epicurean argument generates a problem. It contradicts one of our deepest intuitions. When a vibrant 25-year-old dies in an accident, we do not think merely that others are harmed by the loss. We think the young person herself has been harmed. She had plans, relationships, experiences ahead of her. Something terrible happened to her, not just to those who loved her. The Epicurean argument seems to deny what we most firmly believe, that death can be a terrible misfortune for the one who dies. This is where contemporary philosophy enters with what is called the deprivation account of death's badness. This view, developed most influentially by philosopher Thomas Nagel, accepts that death is not an intrinsically bad experience. Being dead feels like nothing because there is no one to feel anything. But death can still be bad for you in a different way, by depriving you of the goods you would have had if you had continued living. Think of it this way. Imagine someone betrays you, but you never find out. You live your whole life believing your friend was loyal. The betrayal causes you no suffering because you remain unaware of it. Yet many of us would say the betrayal still harms you. It makes your life worse than it would have been if the betrayal had not occurred, even though you never experience any bad feelings about it. Similarly, death makes your life as a whole shorter and less good than it could have been, even though you never experience the state of being dead as unpleasant. This is called a comparative harm. Death is bad not because the state of being dead is unpleasant, but because it prevents the continuation of your life. If your life would have contained more good experiences, more love, more achievement, more beauty, then death deprives you of those goods. The harm consists in what you lose, not in what you feel. Consider Nagel's example. Imagine an intelligent, accomplished adult suffers a brain injury that reduces him to the mental state of a contented infant. He seems happy enough in his new state, unaware of what he has lost. Yet we rightly view this as a terrible tragedy for him. The harm is not in his current experience, but in the loss of capacities, the foreclosure of possibilities, the extinction of the person he was. Death works the same way, only more completely. It forecloses all future possibilities. The deprivation account faces its own challenges. The most serious is the timing problem, first identified by Epicurus himself. If death harms you by depriving you of future goods, when does this harm occur? It cannot occur before death, because you are still alive. It cannot occur at the moment of death, because that moment is instantaneous, and it cannot occur after death, because you no longer exist. So when does death make you worse off? Defenders of the deprivation account have several responses. One is to deny that harms must occur at a specific time. The harm of death consists in the fact that your life as a whole contains less good than it would have otherwise. This is a timeless comparative fact about two possible lives, one actual and one counterfactual. Just as a novel can be bad because it is too short, even though there is no specific moment where the badness occurs, a life can be bad because it is cut short. But this response leads to more questions. If death harms you by depriving you of future goods, does that mean being born later also harms you? If you had been born 10 years earlier, you would have had 10 more years of life and all the goods those years contained. By the logic of deprivation, your actual birth date deprived you of those goods, yet we do not typically think our birth date was a misfortune for us. This is called the asymmetry problem. Death and late birth both deprive you of possible goods, but only death seems bad. Philosophers Anthony Bruckner and John Martin Fisher argue that this asymmetry reflects a deep fact about human psychology and practical rationality. We care about our future in a way we do not care about an extended past. We form plans, set goals, cultivate relationships, all oriented toward our future. Death frustrates these forward-looking concerns in a way that late birth does not frustrate any backward-looking concerns we actually have. Critics respond that this explanation merely describes our psychological attitudes without justifying them. Perhaps our bias toward the future is itself irrational, just an evolutionary quirk that makes us focus on survival and reproduction. If so, the fact that we care more about future deprivations than past deprivations does not show that future deprivations are objectively worse. The deprivation account also struggles with cases where death might not deprive someone of good things. What about someone terminally ill, suffering unbearable pain with no hope of improvement? For such a person, continued life contains no goods, only harms. Ad sum contra odum. Death does not deprive them of anything valuable. Indeed, death might benefit them by ending their suffering. This suggests that whether death is bad depends entirely on what your future would have held. Death is contingently bad, not intrinsically bad. This conclusion has practical implications. It suggests that the appropriate response to death varies dramatically depending on circumstances. The death of a happy child is an enormous tragedy because of all the goods lost. The death of someone in extreme suffering at the end of a long, full life may be no tragedy at all, perhaps even a blessing. This matches many people's moral intuitions, but seems to drain death of any essential significance. Another challenge comes from what we might call the better alternative problem. The deprivation account says death is bad because it deprives you of goods you would have had. But which goods exactly? If you die at age 70, we compare your actual life to a counterfactual life where you live to 71, or 80, or 100. But why stop there? Why not compare to a life of 200 years, or 1,000, or eternal life? If we use infinite life as the comparison point, then every death is infinitely bad because it deprives you of infinite goods. This seems absurd. Defenders of the deprivation account typically respond that the relevant comparison is to the life you would have actually lived if death had not occurred at the specific time it did. If you die at 70 from a heart attack, we compare your 70-year life to the life you would have had if you had not had that heart attack. Maybe you would have lived to 85. Death deprived you of 15 years, not infinite years. The harm is real but finite. Yet this response reveals how context-dependent judgments about death's badness become. The same death can be very bad or not so bad, depending on what alternative we imagine. An elderly person who dies before their time at 80 suffers a harm only if they would have lived longer in good health. If they were declining rapidly, death at 80 might deprive them of very little. The badness of death is not intrinsic to death itself, but depends on complex counterfactual comparisons. The Epicurean might press further. Even if we grant that death deprives people of goods, why does this deprivation matter to the person who dies? After all, the person no longer exists to care about what they have lost. Imagine you are deeply invested in a project that will take 5 more years to complete. Suddenly, you die. The project remains unfinished. But why should this matter to you when you no longer exist to care about unfinished projects? Your preferences, goals, and values all vanish with your consciousness. From the perspective of non-existence, nothing matters. This objection reveals something crucial. The deprivation account requires us to make judgments about how well someone's life went for them even after they cease to exist. It treats the value of a life as something that can be assessed as a completed whole, independent of whether the person continues to exist to evaluate it. This is not absurd. We make similar judgments about works of art, which can be better or worse even after their creator dies. But it does require us to accept that harms and benefits need not be experienced to be real. The debates become even more complex when we introduce questions about personal identity. Exactly who is harmed by death? The 40-year-old who dies is not identical to the 60-year-old she would have become. Different cells, different memories, different personality traits. In what sense does the death harm the 60-year-old who never exists? Perhaps we should say death harms not a person, but a life trajectory. But life trajectories are abstract entities, not the kind of thing that can be harmed or benefited in the morally relevant sense. These philosophical puzzles might seem disconnected from practical concerns, but they have real consequences. In medical ethics, the question of whether death always harms the patient affects decisions about life support, euthanasia, and resource allocation. In law, wrongful death cases rely on the premise that death itself is a harm for which compensation is owed. In psychology, whether we should view death as an enemy to be defeated or a natural part of life depends partly on whether death is genuinely bad for those who die. What the harm thesis debate reveals most powerfully is this. Even the most basic claims about death resist simple analysis. The intuition that death is bad for the person who dies seems obvious until we try to explain exactly how and when and why. The Epicurean challenge forces us to clarify what we mean by harm, value, and personal well-being. The deprivation account offers a sophisticated response, but generates new puzzles about time, identity, and counterfactual reasoning. Perhaps most significantly, this debate shows that facts about value and harm are not simply facts about subjective experience. The deprivation account treats it as objectively true that a life cut short goes worse for the person, even though that person never experiences the badness. This requires a conception of human flourishing that transcends momentary experience. It implies that what matters is not just how life feels from the inside, but how it goes as a unified whole, measured against how it could have gone. The argument continues, refined by each generation of philosophers who bring new conceptual tools to bear on the ancient question. No consensus has emerged because the question touches something irreducible about human value and meaning. What we believe about death's badness shapes how we structure our entire lives, what risks we accept, what sacrifices we make, and how we comfort the dying and the bereaved. The philosophical arguments matter because they are arguments about what ultimately matters. Part 2. Being toward death, Heidegger and existential authenticity. Martin Heidegger approached death not as a biological event to be analyzed from the outside, but as a fundamental structure of human existence that shapes who we are from the inside. His analysis in Being and Time represents one of the most influential and difficult accounts of mortality in 20th century philosophy. Where Epicurus asked whether death harms us and Nagel analyzed death as deprivation, Heidegger examined how the awareness of our mortality constitutes the very fabric of human existence. Heidegger uses the term Dasein, meaning literally being there, to designate human existence. What distinguishes Dasein from other entities is that its being is an issue for it. A rock simply exists. A tree grows according to biological programming. But humans must take a stance on their own existence. We cannot avoid choosing how to be. This inescapability of choice, this burden of having to make something of ourselves, defines human existence. Central to Heidegger's analysis is the concept of being toward death. This does not mean constantly thinking about death or morbidly obsessing over mortality. Rather, it describes a fundamental structure of how human existence unfolds temporally. From the moment we are born, we are old enough to die. Death is not a distant endpoint that we approach like a train arriving at a station. Instead, death saturates our existence at every moment. We are always already dying. Heidegger describes this as an eminent imminence. Death is both absolutely certain and absolutely indefinite in its timing. Think of how a fruit ripens. Ripening is not something that happens to the fruit at the end of its existence. The fruit is ripening throughout its existence. Ripening is what the fruit is doing in its very being. Similarly, dying is not just the final moment when life ceases. Dying is what we are doing throughout our lives. We are beings toward death, always moving toward our ultimate possibility. This might sound like mere wordplay, but Heidegger's insight cuts deep. Our mortality is not an external fact we learn about ourselves. It is internal to the structure of our existence. Every project we undertake, every relationship we form, every choice we make occurs against the background of our finitude. Death is the horizon that gives shape to our existence. Heidegger introduces a crucial distinction between authentic and inauthentic existence. In our everyday lives, we typically exist inauthentically. We lose ourselves in what Heidegger calls the they, the anonymous mass of social conventions, expectations and roles. They tell us how to dress, what to value, what to fear, how to live. We become absorbed in everyday concerns, scattered across various roles and identities. We are students, employees, parents, citizens, but we lose sight of the fact that we are, most fundamentally, finite beings whose existence will end. The they has a particular way of dealing with death. When someone dies, we say things like, people die, or death happens. We acknowledge death as a fact, but distance ourselves from it. Yes, people die, but not me, not now. Death is something that happens to others, something public and general. The they transforms death into an impersonal event, something to be managed with proper social rituals, but not truly confronted. This everyday evasion of death represents what Heidegger calls fleeing in the face of death. We know intellectually that we will die, but we avoid truly grasping our own mortality. We tranquilize ourselves with busyness, entertainment, social conformity. We tell ourselves there is plenty of time. Death is real but distant, always for later, always for someone else first. Authentic existence requires a different relationship to death. It requires what Heidegger calls anticipation, or running ahead toward death. This does not mean brooding over death or thinking morbidly about dying. Rather, it means existentially owning the fact that you are going to die, that this death is yours alone, that no one can die your death for you, and that death is the ultimate non-relational possibility. You face it in radical solitude. When you authentically anticipate your death, something profound happens. You recognize that your existence is finite, that you have only so much time, that your possibilities are limited. This recognition is accompanied by a distinctive mood that Heidegger calls anxiety. This anxiety differs fundamentally from fear. Fear has a specific object. You fear this disease, that accident, a particular threat. Anxiety has no specific object. In anxiety, everything familiar becomes strange. The world that seemed so solid and meaningful reveals itself as groundless. Anxiety is deeply uncomfortable, which is why we flee from it. But Heidegger argues that anxiety is also profoundly revealing. In anxiety, all the roles and identities we have absorbed they fall away. We are confronted with our existence in its nakedness, a finite life that I must somehow make my own, without ultimate justification, without guarantee of meaning, without escape from the responsibility of choosing who to be. This might sound terrifying, and in one sense it is. But Heidegger sees in this existential anxiety the possibility of freedom. When you recognize that your existence is finite, and that you cannot escape the responsibility of making something of yourself, you also recognize that you are free to choose. The conventions of the they no longer determine you. You can take ownership of your existence and live according to possibilities you genuinely affirm, rather than simply drifting along with social expectations. Authentic being toward death thus involves what Heidegger calls resoluteness. You resolutely choose to be yourself, accepting your finitude and taking responsibility for your existence. This does not mean having a detailed life plan. Rather, it means living with a certain existential clarity about who you are and what matters to you, undeceived by comforting illusions about your permanence. Consider how this plays out practically. The inauthentic person delays important choices, thinking there is always time. They compromise their deepest commitments to conform to social expectations, assuming their real life will begin later. They avoid difficult conversations, postpone meaningful projects, suppress uncomfortable truths. They live as if they have infinite time, and as if their life belongs to others rather than themselves. The authentic person recognizes the urgency imposed by finitude. Not every possibility can be realized. Choosing one path means foreclosing others. There is no time to waste on projects you do not genuinely value or relationships you do not truly care about. Death gives life a shape and demands that you take your existence seriously. Your time is limited, and it is yours to spend. But Heidegger's analysis faces serious challenges. First, it remains unclear whether his distinction between authentic and inauthentic existence is merely descriptive or also normative. Is Heidegger simply describing two different ways of existing, or is he saying we ought to exist authentically? He claims to be doing pure ontological analysis, but his language drips with evaluative overtones. Authenticity sounds better than inauthenticity. Yet if Heidegger is making a normative claim, what grounds this claim? Why should we prefer authentic existence? Second, critics argue that Heidegger's account is excessively individualistic. Authentic being toward death radically individualizes Dasein. You face your death alone. No one can die for you. This emphasis on solitary confrontation with mortality seems to undermine the possibility of genuine connection with others. If authentic existence means recognizing that you are fundamentally alone in facing your death, does this not make love, friendship, and community merely inauthentic distractions? Heidegger would respond that authentic being with others is possible, but only after you have first achieved authentic being toward death. By recognizing your own finitude and taking ownership of your existence, you become capable of letting others be themselves, rather than trying to lose yourself in them or dominate them. But critics remain unconvinced. The whole structure of Heidegger's analysis seems to prioritize individual existence over relational existence in a way that distorts human life. Third, there is something paradoxical about Heidegger's notion of anxiety. He describes anxiety as revealing the groundlessness of existence, the absence of ultimate justification for our projects and values. In anxiety, we confront the sheer facticity that we exist without knowing why or what for. Yet Heidegger simultaneously suggests that authentic existence involves resolutely choosing your possibilities. But if existence is genuinely groundless, if there are no objective standards for choosing, how can any choice be more authentic than any other? Does not the revelation of meaninglessness in anxiety undermine the very possibility of authentic commitment? Fourth, feminist and social critics argue that Heidegger's analysis reflects a particularly masculine, Western, privileged perspective. The freedom to choose one's existence presupposes social and material conditions many people lack. For someone struggling to survive, facing systemic oppression, or caring for dependent others, the luxury of authentic self-creation may be unavailable. Heidegger's Dasein seems to be an abstract individual disconnected from concrete social realities and relationships of care. Fifth, the psychological plausibility of Heidegger's account is questionable. Does death anxiety really have the central constitutive role Heidegger assigns it? Or is this a projection of Heidegger's own preoccupations onto human existence generally? Empirical psychology suggests that most people, most of the time, do not experience existential anxiety about their mortality. They live contentedly absorbed in everyday concerns. Is this all inauthentic fleeing, or might it reflect a perfectly healthy way of being? Despite these criticisms, Heidegger's analysis has proven enormously influential. It reframes death as not merely a biological fact or a deprivation of goods, but as a fundamental existential structure that shapes the meaning of human life. The insight that we are beings toward death, that our finitude is not external but internal to who we are, has deeply affected subsequent philosophy, psychology, theology, and literature. Heidegger forces us to ask, what does it mean to truly own your mortality? Most of us acknowledge intellectually that we will die, but we do not live as if we genuinely believe it. We postpone, we compromise, we drift. Heidegger challenges us to live with full awareness of our finitude, to let this awareness transform how we choose and what we value. The existential therapy movement, developed by psychologists influenced by Heidegger, applies these insights clinically. Existential therapists help clients confront their death anxiety, not to eliminate it, but to use it as a catalyst for authentic living. The client who realizes she has been living according to others' expectations, who has postponed her genuine desires, thinking there is always time, who has avoided difficult truths to maintain comfort. This client can use awareness of mortality as motivation for change. Death becomes not an enemy, but a teacher. Yet we must be careful not to romanticize death or fetishize anxiety. Not every form of death awareness leads to authentic existence. Some people become paralyzed by awareness of mortality, unable to commit to anything because everything seems futile in the face of death. Others use death as an excuse for reckless behavior, abandoning responsibilities under the banner of living authentically. Still others fall into what we might call performative authenticity, adopting the external markers of individualism while remaining deeply conformist. Heidegger himself provides little practical guidance about what authentic existence actually looks like. His analysis remains formal and abstract. He tells us to anticipate death, to choose resolutely, to own our existence, but he does not tell us what to choose or how to live. This is intentional. Heidegger thinks authentic existence cannot be prescribed but must be achieved by each person individually. But it leaves his philosophy vulnerable to appropriation by any ideology or lifestyle that claims to reject conformity. More troubling, Heidegger's own life raises questions about the connection between his philosophy and practice. He joined the Nazi Party in 1933 and served as rector of Freiburg University under Nazi rule. His subsequent attempts to explain or excuse this involvement were inadequate. This biographical fact does not automatically invalidate his philosophical work, but it does suggest that authentic being toward death provides no guarantee of moral decency. You can resolutely own your mortality and still make monstrous choices. Perhaps the deepest issue with Heidegger's analysis is this. By making death so central to human existence, does he not risk making life merely a preparation for death? There is something morbid about a philosophy that defines human existence primarily through its relationship to non-existence. Yes, we are mortal, and yes, this matters. But are we not also many other things? Beings capable of love, creativity, joy, wonder? Does the emphasis on death not overshadow these other dimensions of human existence? Some later existentialists tried to balance Heidegger's death-focused analysis with attention to life-affirming experiences. Albert Camus argued that we should rebel against death by embracing life's beauty despite its absurdity. Simone de Beauvoir emphasized that human existence is fundamentally ambiguous, characterized not only by finitude but also by the capacity for transcendence through projects and relationships. Emmanuel Levinas challenged Heidegger's entire framework, arguing that ethics and our relationship to the other should be more fundamental than any analysis of death. What remains valuable in Heidegger's analysis is the recognition that death is not just something that happens to us at life's end, but a condition that shapes how we exist throughout our lives. The way we relate to our mortality affects the choices we make, the commitments we form, the risks we take, and the meaning we find. Whether or not we accept Heidegger's specific framework, his central insight stands. We are temporal beings whose existence stretches between birth and death, and this temporality is not incidental but essential to who we are. The question Heidegger leaves us with is practical and urgent. How should we live in light of our mortality? Should we constantly keep death in mind, or does this lead to morbidity? Should we mostly forget about death to enjoy life, or does this lead to inauthenticity? is there a middle path between obsessive death awareness and complete denial? These questions have no simple answers, but Heidegger has ensured we cannot think seriously about human existence without addressing them. Part 3. Terror Management. The Psychological Architecture of Death Denial. While Heidegger analyzed death from a philosophical perspective, a parallel line of investigation emerged from psychology and anthropology. This research suggests that awareness of mortality shapes human behavior far more pervasively and unconsciously than most of us realize. The theory of terror management, developed from anthropologist Ernest Becker's work and empirically tested by psychologists over more than 30 years, presents a disturbing picture. Much of what we call human culture exists primarily to help us avoid thinking about death. Ernest Becker's 1973 book, The Denial of Death, won the Pulitzer Prize 2 months after he died of cancer. The book synthesized insights from Freud, Kierkegaard, Otto Rank, and others into a grand theory of human motivation. Becker's central claim is radical. The fear of death is the mainspring of human activity. Most of what we do, individually and collectively, serves to deny, minimize, or symbolically transcend our mortality. Becker observed that humans occupy a unique and uncomfortable position in nature. We are animals, biological organisms subject to decay and death like all other creatures. But unlike other animals, we possess symbolic consciousness. We can think abstractly, imagine the future, and reflect on ourselves. This combination creates an existential predicament. We have an overwhelming biological drive to survive, yet we know with absolute certainty that we will eventually die. We are gods with anuses, as Becker provocatively put it, creatures capable of contemplating eternity but trapped in decaying bodies that will one day cease to function. This awareness creates what Becker called the terror of death. Not merely fear, but terror, a profound, potentially debilitating anxiety that strikes at the core of our being. The thought of our own non-existence, of the world continuing without us, of everything we are simply ending, triggers a primal dread. If we face this terror directly and constantly, we would be psychologically paralyzed, unable to function. But we do function. We get up in the morning, go to work, form relationships, pursue goals. How is this possible if we carry the constant knowledge of our mortality? Becker's answer: we construct elaborate psychological and cultural defense mechanisms that allow us to deny or minimize death's significance. We do not consciously choose to build these defenses. They operate largely outside awareness, shaping our behavior without our recognition. The most important defense mechanism, according to Becker, is culture itself. Every human society constructs what Becker called a cultural worldview, a shared system of beliefs about reality that gives life meaning and offers pathways to transcending death. Religious worldviews offer literal immortality through an afterlife. Secular worldviews offer symbolic immortality through lasting achievements, contributions to progress, or merging with something larger than oneself. The nation, the species, the advance of knowledge. Cultural worldviews serve two crucial functions. First, they provide an account of reality that makes existence meaningful. They explain where we came from, why we are here, what matters, and how we should live. This sense of meaning protects against the existential terror that would otherwise arise from confronting our cosmic insignificance. Second, cultural worldviews establish standards of value that allow individuals to achieve self-esteem by living up to cultural ideals. If you meet the standards of your culture, being a good Christian, a successful entrepreneur, a devoted parent, a respected scholar. You gain a sense of personal worth that buffers against death anxiety. Becker called individual efforts to achieve significance within a cultural framework heroism projects or immortality projects. These are the activities and achievements through which we seek to matter, to stand out, to leave a mark. The specific content varies by culture. In one culture, heroism might mean religious devotion and sacrifice. In another, it might mean accumulating wealth and power. In yet another, it might mean artistic creation or scientific discovery. But the underlying psychological function remains the same: to create a sense of personal significance that transcends mortality. This analysis suggests something unsettling. Much of what we consider our highest aspirations, art, science, philosophy, religion, social progress, may be rooted in the flight from death. Our noblest accomplishments serve partly as elaborate denial mechanisms. Becker did not claim this exhausts the meaning of human achievement, but he did claim that death denial provides a powerful and often unrecognized motivation. The real breakthrough came when social psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pyszczynski formalized Becker's ideas into terror management theory and began testing the theory empirically. Starting in the 1980s and continuing to the present, researchers have conducted over 1,000 experiments testing the theory's predictions. The results provide remarkable support for Becker's core insights. The basic experimental paradigm is elegant. Researchers induce mortality salience. They make participants consciously aware of their mortality, typically by asking them to briefly write about their own death. Other participants receive control conditions, perhaps writing about dental pain or another unpleasant but non-death-related topic. Then, after a brief delay, allowing the death thoughts to fade from conscious awareness but remain active unconsciously, researchers measure various attitudes and behaviors. The findings are startling. When mortality is made salient, people show stronger allegiance to their cultural worldviews. American participants who wrote about death show more positive attitudes toward America and more negative attitudes toward other countries. Religious believers become more religious. People become harsher toward those who violate cultural norms and more favorable toward those who uphold them. The effect appears across cultures, age groups, and personality types. Mortality salience also increases efforts to boost self-esteem. People become more concerned with their appearance, more materialistic, more competitive. They rate themselves more positively and show more bias toward others who praise them. They become more interested in forming romantic relationships and having children, literal and symbolic paths to immortality. Perhaps most disturbing, mortality salience increases prejudice and aggression toward those who are different. When reminded of death, people become more hostile toward other religions, ethnicities, and political groups. They show stronger support for aggressive military action and harsher punishment of criminals. They become more conformist, less tolerant of dissent, and more supportive of charismatic leaders who promise security and certainty. The theory explains this as worldview defense. If your cultural worldview protects you from death anxiety, anyone who challenges that worldview threatens your psychological security. People with different beliefs, values, or lifestyles represent a potential threat because their very existence suggests your worldview might be wrong. If your worldview is wrong, you lose your death anxiety buffer. Therefore, the unconscious response is to denigrate, exclude, or even eliminate those who are different. This has profound implications for understanding human conflict. Much intergroup violence, religious wars, ethnic cleansing, political persecution may be driven unconsciously by death anxiety. Groups define themselves in opposition to others partly to bolster their own significance and coherence. Scapegoating allows groups to project their anxiety onto external enemies. As Becker wrote, only scapegoats can relieve one of his own stark death fear. The theory also explains why people cling to irrational beliefs even when confronted with contrary evidence. If a belief system provides existential comfort by buffering death anxiety, evidence against that belief system threatens psychological security. People will distort or reject evidence to preserve beliefs that protect them from terror. This applies not only to religious beliefs, but to any strongly held worldview, political ideology, scientific paradigm, cultural identity. Research has extended these findings to explain phenomena ranging from consumerism to environmental destruction. Consumer culture offers immortality symbols through products that promise status, beauty, and lasting impact. We accumulate possessions partly to create a sense of permanence in the face of impermanence. Environmental degradation may persist partly because addressing it requires acknowledging our vulnerability and mortality, the fact that nature will continue regardless of our existence. Terror management theory also illuminates self-esteem's function. Why do humans universally seek self-esteem? Traditional psychology struggled to answer this. Terror management theory suggests self-esteem is the feeling that you are a valuable person within a meaningful cultural framework. High self-esteem buffers death anxiety. Experiments confirm that boosting self-esteem reduces anxiety in general and specifically reduces death-related anxiety. Conversely, threats to self-esteem increase death thought accessibility. This explains why people are so sensitive to status, comparison, and social evaluation. Self-esteem requires validation from others who share your cultural worldview. You need others to confirm that you meet cultural standards, that you matter, that your existence has significance. This makes us exquisitely attuned to social feedback and vulnerable to shame and rejection. But terror management theory faces important criticisms. First, the causal direction remains unclear. Does death anxiety drive cultural attachment and self-esteem seeking, or do threats to culture and self-esteem activate death anxiety? The theory claims the former, but the evidence is correlational in many cases. Perhaps culture and self-esteem evolved for other reasons and happen to provide death anxiety buffering as a side effect. Second, the theory may overstate death's role. Human motivation is complex. Yes, death anxiety influences behavior, but so do many other factors: sexual desire, status competition, curiosity, empathy, hunger for meaning, independent of mortality concerns. Reducing all cultural achievement to death denial seems reductive. Art, science, and love may involve death transcendence, but they also involve genuine engagement with beauty, truth, and connection. Third, cultural worldviews vary dramatically in how they address death. Some emphasize death acceptance rather than denial. Buddhism encourages meditation on impermanence and death. Stoicism teaches that we should contemplate mortality to live virtuously. Mexican culture celebrates death in the Day of the Dead festival. These traditions do not simply deny death, but engage with it directly. Terror management theory struggles to accommodate cultural variations in death attitudes. Fourth, the theory's political implications are concerning. If awareness of mortality increases prejudice, authoritarianism, and aggression, should we avoid thinking about death? Should we keep people distracted and comfortable to prevent violence? This seems both impractical and ethically questionable. Moreover, some research suggests that certain forms of death reflection can actually increase compassion and prosocial behavior rather than defensiveness. Fifth, the experimental manipulations used in terror management research may not reflect how death awareness operates in ordinary life. Writing about your own death for 3 minutes in a psychology lab is an artificial and somewhat morbid exercise. Does this really capture the subtle, pervasive influence of mortality on everyday life? Or does it create an unusually intense death anxiety that produces atypical responses? Defenders of the theory have responses to these criticisms. They argue that 3 decades of research across multiple methods and cultures demonstrates the robustness of terror management effects. They acknowledge that death anxiety is not the only human motivation, but insist it is more pervasive and powerful than typically recognized. They distinguish between conscious death contemplation, which can be wise and beneficial, and unconscious death anxiety, which drives defensive and destructive behavior. The theory has also been refined to distinguish between proximal and distal defenses against death anxiety. Proximal defenses operate when death is conscious and focal. In these situations, people engage in rational threat-focused coping, like seeking medical care or avoiding danger. Distal defenses operate when death thoughts are active but outside awareness. In these situations, people engage in symbolic, worldview-based coping like cultural defense and self-esteem striving. The theory predicts different responses depending on whether death is consciously salient or unconsciously active. Recent research has explored whether positive forms of terror management exist. Can awareness of mortality lead to growth, compassion, and wisdom rather than only defensiveness and aggression? Some studies suggest yes. Certain types of death reflection, especially in contexts that encourage self-transcendence or connection with nature, can increase gratitude, generosity, and concern for future generations. The key seems to be creating conditions where mortality awareness promotes what researchers call growth-oriented rather than validation-seeking responses. The theory's most profound implication is that human nature may be more fundamentally driven by anxiety than we typically acknowledge. Freud emphasized the role of unconscious desires. Terror management. Theory emphasizes the role of unconscious fears. We are not rational creatures whose actions reflect careful deliberation about values and goals. We are anxious creatures whose actions reflect largely unconscious efforts to manage existential terror. This has implications for how we understand ourselves and others. That person aggressively defending their political views may not be responding rationally to evidence, but unconsciously protecting an anxiety buffer. That culture's harsh treatment of outsiders may not reflect rational threat assessment, but symbolic defense against death. That individual's obsessive pursuit of status and achievement may not reflect genuine passion, but desperate striving for significance in the face of mortality. If terror management theory is correct, much human behavior that appears rational, meaningful, or noble actually stems from death denial. This need not be entirely cynical or reductive. Death denial can motivate genuine achievements. Cultural worldviews that buffer death anxiety can also promote cooperation, creativity, and flourishing. Self-esteem seeking can motivate excellence. The problem arises when death denial takes destructive forms. Prejudice, violence, environmental degradation, refusal to accept evidence. The theory suggests that becoming more aware of death's influence on our behavior might help us respond more wisely. If you recognize that your harsh judgment of others stems partly from death anxiety rather than objective moral evaluation, you might temper your judgments. If you recognize that your obsessive busyness serves partly to avoid existential questions rather than accomplish important goals, you might slow down and reconsider your priorities. If you recognize that your attachment to certain beliefs serves partly to buffer anxiety rather than represent truth, you might hold beliefs more lightly. But can we really become conscious of these unconscious processes? Terror management researchers acknowledge this is difficult. Death denial operates automatically outside awareness, precisely because it serves a defensive function. Bringing these processes into consciousness threatens to undermine their effectiveness. This creates a paradox. The more aware you become of how death anxiety drives your behavior, the more you may need to find new ways of managing that anxiety. Some researchers and theorists suggest the solution is not to eliminate death anxiety. This may be impossible, but to find healthier ways of managing it. Rather than denying death or defending against it rigidly, we might develop what has been called mature death acceptance. This involves acknowledging mortality fully while finding sources of meaning and significance that do not require rigid worldview defense or denigration of others. Mature death acceptance might draw from philosophical traditions like Stoicism or Buddhism that emphasize accepting impermanence. It might involve finding meaning in present experience rather than future legacy. It might mean deriving significance from contribution to others' well-being rather than personal achievement. It might involve holding cultural worldviews more lightly, recognizing them as human constructions rather than absolute truths. Research on what are called positive forms of death reflection suggests this is possible. When people engage in structured contemplation of mortality in contexts that emphasize gratitude, connection, or self-transcendence, they often show increases in prosocial behavior, life satisfaction, and psychological growth. The key seems to be framing death awareness not as a threat, but as a motivator for living fully and caringly. Terror management theory ultimately presents a sobering vision of human nature. We are not as rational, noble, or consciously motivated as we like to believe. Much of what we do serves unconscious defensive functions. Our highest cultural achievements and our worst atrocities both stem partly from the same source, the terror of mortality and the desperate need to transcend it. This does not make us contemptible, but it does make us vulnerable to manipulation and prone to destructive behavior when death anxiety is activated. Understanding terror management processes provides tools for recognizing when death anxiety influences our own behavior and when leaders or movements exploit death anxiety for political purposes. Fear-mongering works partly by activating death anxiety, making people more defensive and authoritarian. Recognizing this pattern can help us respond more rationally to manufactured threats. The theory also highlights how death attitudes shape entire societies. Cultures that directly acknowledge death and provide healthy rituals for engaging with mortality may produce citizens less prone to defensive violence and more capable of compassion. Cultures that encourage death denial and promise illusory invulnerability may produce citizens more anxious and aggressive when their world views are threatened by. What terror management theory shares with Heidegger's existential analysis is the recognition that death awareness profoundly shapes human existence. Where they differ is in emphasis. Heidegger saw authentic confrontation with death as liberating and individualizing. Terror management theory sees death awareness as producing anxiety that drives conformity and worldview defense. Perhaps both are true. Death awareness can liberate or terrify depending on how we engage with it, consciously and reflectively versus unconsciously and defensively. Part 4. The symmetry problem. Why we fear death, but not prenatal non-existence. One of the most persistent puzzles in the philosophy of death concerns temporal asymmetry. We regard death as bad, even tragic, especially when it comes prematurely. Yet we do not regard our late birth as similarly unfortunate. This asymmetry seems irrational. Both death and late birth deprive us of existence. If you had been born 10 years earlier, you would have had 10 additional years of life. If you live 10 years longer than you actually will, you would also have 10 additional years. Why does one deprivation concern us while the other does not? This puzzle originated with the Roman poet Lucretius, a follower of Epicurus. Lucretius argued that if we find death troubling because it deprives us of future life, we should find it equally troubling that we were not born earlier, thus being deprived of past life. He wrote that the time before our birth was a mirror of the time after our death. In both periods, we do not exist. If we are not disturbed by the infinite time before our birth, we should not be disturbed by the time after our death. The argument has elegant logical structure. Consider two people, Alice and Betty. Alice is born in 2000 and dies in 2025 at age 25. Betty is born in 1990 and dies in 2040 at age 50. Betty exists for 25 more years than Alice. We can describe this in two ways. First, Betty lives longer after birth before dying. She gets 25 additional years of post-birth life. Second, Alice is born 25 years later than Betty. She misses out on 25 years of pre-death existence. These are just two descriptions of the same fact. Betty exists for more years than Alice. But our evaluative responses differ dramatically. We think Betty is fortunate compared to Alice because Betty lives 50 years while Alice lives only 25. We think Alice's early death at 25 is tragic. But we do not think Alice is unfortunate compared to Betty because Alice was born later. We do not think Alice's late birth in 2000 rather than 1990 is tragic. Yet both represent the same deprivation of 25 years of life. Or consider a single person who dies at age 70. We can imagine two counterfactuals. In one, she lives to age 80, gaining 10 extra years at life's end. In the other, she is born 10 years earlier, gaining 10 extra years at life's beginning. Both counterfactuals involve the same person living 80 years instead of 70. But we care far more about the first scenario than the second. Living longer seems valuable, but having been born earlier seems barely relevant. This asymmetry threatens the deprivation account of death's badness. If death is bad, because it deprives us of goods we would otherwise have had, late birth should be bad for the same reason. Both shorten our lives relative to how long we could have lived. Yet we care intensely about one and barely at all about the other. This suggests our concern about death is not really about deprivation per se, but about something else that lacks the symmetry the deprivation account implies. Philosophers have proposed several explanations for this asymmetry. One strategy is to deny the asymmetry and accept that late birth is indeed unfortunate. Fred Feldman bites the bullet and argues that if you would have had a good life had you been born earlier, then your actual birth date does deprive you of goods and is comparatively bad for you. You just never think about this deprivation or feel bad about it because you have no backward-looking desires or concerns about not existing earlier. This response preserves the logic of the deprivation account, but strikes most people as counterintuitive. It implies that literally everyone suffers one of the greatest possible misfortunes. We could all have had more life if we had been born earlier. Every human is deprived of infinite possible past life. This seems to trivialize the concept of misfortune. If everyone suffers the maximal deprivation, the concept loses practical meaning. A more popular response focuses on psychological and practical asymmetries between the future and the past. We care about our future in ways we do not care about a possible extended past. We form plans, set goals, cultivate relationships, develop skills, all oriented toward our future. Death frustrates these forward-looking concerns. It cuts short projects in progress, relationships that continue to develop, plans yet to be realized. Late birth frustrates no comparable backward-looking concerns because we do not form plans about not having existed earlier. Philosophers Anthony Bruckner and John Martin Fisher developed this response most systematically. They argue that we care more about future goods than equally real past goods we might have had. This is not irrational. It reflects facts about human psychology and agency. We can affect our future, but not our past. We invest emotionally in what lies ahead, but not in what might have been before we existed. Death threatens what we care about, our future, while late birth does not threaten anything we actually care about. Critics respond that this merely describes our psychological attitudes without justifying them. Perhaps our bias toward the future is itself irrational or arbitrary. Why should temporal location make a difference to whether a deprivation harms us? If deprivation of good is what makes death bad, temporal location seems irrelevant. The fact that we care more about future deprivations than past deprivations does not show that future deprivations are objectively worse. Derek Parfit famously argued that temporal bias toward the future is indeed irrational. Suppose you are in a hospital. The doctor tells you that either yesterday you had a painful hour-long surgery without anesthetic, but you have been given a drug that erases all memory of it, or tomorrow you will have a much less painful 10-minute surgery with partial anesthetic. Which would you prefer to be true? Most people strongly prefer that the painful surgery happened yesterday, even though objectively more suffering exists in that scenario. This suggests our bias toward the future leads us to care more about less objective badness in the future than more objective badness in the past. But maybe temporal bias is not irrational. Perhaps time's direction matters in a deep metaphysical sense. Some philosophers argue that the future is genuinely open in a way the past is not. The past is fixed and determinate. The future contains real possibilities. If so, death closes off real possibilities, while late birth does not similarly close off what was genuinely possible. This explanation requires controversial metaphysical assumptions about time and possibility that many philosophers reject. Another approach emphasizes differences between prenatal and posthumous non-existence. Before you exist, there is no you to be deprived of anything. But once you come into existence, you become the kind of entity that can have goods and be deprived of them. Death deprives an existing person of future goods. Late birth does not deprive any existing person of past goods because there was no person to be deprived before birth. This response faces the objection that death also leaves no person to be deprived. When you die, you cease to exist. There is no longer any you to suffer deprivation. So the asymmetry remains unexplained. If we accept that death harms you despite your non-existence after death, consistency seems to require accepting that late birth harmed you despite your non-existence before birth. Perhaps the key is not existence per se, but identity over time. Once you come into existence, there is a determinate fact about who you are and what your lifespan could have been. Death cuts this life short. But before you exist, there is no determinate fact about when you might have come into existence earlier. There are infinitely many possible earlier starting points, none privileged. So while death deprives you of a determinate possible future, late birth does not deprive you of any determinate possible past. This explanation has some plausibility, but also faces challenges. If we can make counterfactual comparisons about dying later, why can we not make comparable counterfactual comparisons about being born earlier? Both involve imagining a possible world where your lifespan differs from actuality. The metaphysical status seems similar. Another possibility focuses on narrative and biographical considerations. A human life has a natural narrative structure with a beginning, middle, and end. Death cuts this narrative short, leaving stories incomplete, potentials unrealized, relationships severed. This violates our sense of how lives should go. But being born later does not similarly disrupt life's narrative structure. Your life still has a proper beginning, it just begins when it begins. There is no earlier beginning that feels like the proper start of your story. This explanation captures something important about how we experience time and life, but it may merely describe our narrative intuitions rather than justify them. Why should narrative structure matter morally? If the objective good is the total amount of welfare in a life, narrative considerations seem beside the point. The temporal asymmetry problem connects to broader questions about personal identity and what matters in survival. When we care about living longer, what exactly do we care about? Do we care about the future existence of our current selves? But our future selves will differ significantly from our current selves, different memories, different beliefs, different physical constitution. In what sense are they still us? Perhaps what matters is not strict identity, but psychological continuity and connectedness. We care about our future because we will be psychologically continuous with that future person through chains of memory, intention, and character. This psychological connection explains both why we care about the future and why we do not care about an extended past. We have no psychological connections to possible past selves who would have existed if we'd been born earlier, but we do have psychological connections to future selves who will exist if we live longer. But this raises new puzzles. If psychological continuity matters, we should care less about our distant future than our near future, since psychological connections weaken over time. The 80-year-old you will be psychologically quite different from the current 30-year-old you. Yet we do not think dying at 80 is only slightly better than dying at 35. We think it matters a great deal to live those extra 45 years, even if you will be psychologically quite different. Some philosophers argue we should simply accept the asymmetry as a brute fact about human psychology. We are temporally extended creatures who care more about our future than our past. This is not irrational. It is part of what it means to be an agent, a planner, a creature who lives toward the future. Our temporal orientation is as fundamental to our nature as our rationality or sociality. Trying to justify it may be like trying to justify caring about our own welfare over others' welfare. At some point, we reach bedrock facts about human nature that do not require further justification. This response has the virtue of honesty, but the vice of giving up too quickly. Philosophy aims to make explicit the reasons underlying our judgments. If we simply accept that we care more about the future without explanation, we abandon the philosophical project of understanding our values. The temporal asymmetry problem also has practical implications. It affects how we think about life extension technologies. If living longer is valuable, we might invest heavily in extending human lifespan. But if the real value is just total years lived, we could achieve the same thing by starting lives earlier through earlier reproduction. This would create more person years just as effectively as life extension. Yet we strongly prefer extending individual lives over starting more lives earlier. This preference reveals that what we value is not merely total years of existence, but something about continuing an individual life, maintaining projects, extending relationships. Death is bad, not just because it reduces total welfare, but because it interrupts an ongoing life. Birth timing matters less because starting life later does not interrupt anything. The temporal asymmetry also affects end-of-life decisions. If patients could choose between dying now or living one more year in pain, most would choose the extra year despite the pain, especially if they have unfinished business or relationships to maintain. But if they could choose between never having been born or being born to experience 1 year of pain, most would prefer never having been born. This suggests future pain weighs differently than equivalent past pain in life evaluations. Ultimately, the temporal asymmetry problem may be irresolvable because it reflects deep features of human temporal experience and agency that resist full philosophical explanation. We are creatures who exist in time, who remember the past and anticipate the future, who form plans and projects oriented forward. This temporal structure is so fundamental to who we are that our evaluative judgments incorporate it automatically. But even if the asymmetry resists complete explanation, recognizing it matters. It shows that our concern about death is not purely about deprivation of goods understood abstractly. Time's direction matters. The specific way we are embedded in time matters. Death is bad, not just because it shortens life, but because it interrupts an ongoing, temporally extended existence we are actively living through. The puzzle Lucretius identified remains a thorn in the side of the deprivation account. Any complete theory of death's badness must explain why we care so much about when we die, and so little about when we were born. The most promising explanations appeal to facts about human psychology, practical rationality, and our nature as temporally oriented agents. But whether these explanations fully justify the asymmetry or merely describe it remains an open question. Part 5. The immortality question. Would eternal life be desirable? Most people, if offered immortality, would accept without hesitation. Death is the enemy. If we could defeat it, we would solve humanity's greatest problem. But would we? A remarkable philosophical debate suggests that immortality might be worse than mortality, that eternal life might be a curse rather than a blessing. This counterintuitive claim, defended most famously by philosopher Bernard Williams, challenges our deepest assumptions about the value of life and death. Williams's argument centers on a case study. The opera by Czech composer Leos Janáček, titled The Makropoulos Case. The protagonist, Elena Makropoulos, drank an elixir of life at age 42 that prevented aging. She has now lived for 342 years, but she is not happy. She is bored, cold and weary. She finds nothing interesting anymore. When offered another dose of the elixir, she refuses and chooses death instead. Williams uses this case to argue that immortality would eventually become unbearable. The argument has two prongs. First, for life to be meaningfully worth living, it must contain projects, goals and desires that give you reason to continue. These categorical desires, as Williams calls them, are desires that give you reason to want to exist, to fulfill them. Examples include the desire to finish your novel, to see your children grow up, to learn a new language, to travel to Japan. These desires make future life valuable because their fulfillment requires your continued existence. But categorical desires are either repeatable or non-repeatable. Non-repeatable desires can be satisfied once: climbing Mount Everest, writing your autobiography, reconciling with an estranged friend. Repeatable desires can be satisfied multiple times: eating delicious food, listening to music, spending time with loved ones. The problem is that non-repeatable desires get exhausted. After 300 years, you have done everything you ever wanted to do, perhaps many times over. And repeatable desires, Williams argues, eventually become boring through endless repetition. Think about your favorite meal. Now imagine eating it every day for a year, then 10 years, then a century. Eventually, even the most delicious food becomes tedious. The same applies to every repeatable pleasure and activity. Sex, conversation, art, nature, all wonderful in limited doses, but potentially unbearable when endless. The capacity for boredom is built into human psychology. We habituate to stimuli. What seemed exciting becomes routine. What seemed meaningful becomes empty. The second prong of Williams' argument concerns personal identity. For immortality to be desirable, it must be you who continues living, not some other person who happens to have your body. But what makes you the same person over time? Something about continuity of character, memory, values, and personality. Yet these change over time. The person you will be in 300 years might have almost nothing in common with your current self. Different memories, different values, different personality, different interests. Williams argues that either character changes over immortal life or it does not. If character changes radically enough, the immortal being is no longer you in any meaningful sense. The thing that matters, your current self with your current projects and relationships, still dies, just slowly. You are gradually replaced by someone else. If character does not change, you remain frozen, unable to grow or develop. But without change, life becomes static and meaningless. You become trapped in an eternal present, unable to evolve. So we face a dilemma. Either immortal life involves enough change that personal identity is not preserved, in which case you do not actually survive, or it involves too little change, in which case you become psychologically frozen. Neither option is genuinely desirable. Death, on this view, is not merely acceptable but necessary. It is the fact that our time is limited that gives life shape, meaning, and urgency. Thomas Nagel has defended the opposing view that death is always bad, no matter when it comes, and that immortality, properly understood, would be desirable. Nagel argues that Williams's argument depends on an impoverished conception of what could motivate an immortal being. Williams assumes that immortal life would be essentially like current life, just extended indefinitely. But why assume this? An immortal being could develop new capacities, discover new pleasures, engage in projects of unbounded complexity. Consider intellectual inquiry. Mathematics and philosophy contain infinite depths. An immortal being could explore these infinitely without exhaustion. Or consider relationships. An immortal being could form deep connections with successive generations, each unique, or creative pursuits. An immortal artist could work for centuries on a single project, achieving levels of refinement impossible for mortals. Nagel grants that certain goods depend on mortality. The urgency and intensity that finitude creates might be lost. But he argues that immortality brings its own goods that compensate. The ability to see projects through to completion without time pressure. The possibility of accumulating wisdom impossible for limited beings. The experience of witnessing how history unfolds over centuries. These goods are available only to immortal beings. Moreover, Nagel argues, we have no good empirical evidence that immortal life would inevitably become boring. Williams relies on imagining what immortality would be like based on extrapolating from current experience. But we cannot reliably extrapolate from finite to infinite existence. Perhaps beings evolved for immortality would not experience boredom as we do. Perhaps after a few centuries you would enter a new psychological state we cannot currently imagine. The debate has generated extensive philosophical literature exploring various possibilities. Some philosophers distinguish between different types of immortality. Immortality as merely unending life is one thing. But what about immortality with eternal youth, perfect health and unlimited resources? What about immortality with the ability to end your life when you choose but not be forced to die? What about immortality in a world where everyone is immortal versus being immortal alone? The desirability of immortality likely depends on details. Immortality as a decrepit, lonely being in a finite universe that eventually reaches heat, death would be horrific. Immortality as a healthy being with companions in an infinite universe full of novelty might be wonderful. The question is not whether immortality is desirable in the abstract, but under what conditions and in what form. Some philosophers argue the real issue is not immortality versus mortality, but meaning and value. Whether life is finite or infinite, the question is whether it contains sufficient meaning and value to be worth living. A finite life can be deeply meaningful. An infinite life can be empty. Conversely, a finite life can be hollow, and an infinite life deeply meaningful. Duration alone does not determine value. This connects to questions about narrative. Finite lives have narrative structure, beginning, middle, end. This structure creates patterns of development, climax, resolution. Immortal life has no narrative arc, only episodic existence. Some argue this makes immortal life meaningless, lacking the unity that narrative provides. Others argue that episodic existence could have its own kind of value, that we overemphasize narrative unity because of our mortal perspective. Practical questions arise. If humanity developed the technology to radically extend lifespan or achieve immortality, should we use it? The answer depends partly on whether extremely long life would be desirable, but it also depends on social and ethical considerations. Immortality for everyone would create massive population and resource problems. Immortality for some would create unprecedented inequality. The rich could buy eternal life while the poor die. This seems morally intolerable. Moreover, social stagnation might result from immortality. New generations bring new ideas, challenge old assumptions, drive progress. If people never died, social change would slow. Powerful people would remain in power indefinitely. Traditional societies that honor age would freeze completely. Innovation depends partly on turnover. Mortality creates space for novelty. Defenders of life extension respond that we should not embrace death to solve social problems. If the real issue is inequality or stagnation, address those directly through better social arrangements. Do not let people die simply to make room for others or to ensure change. Moreover, most proposed life extension technologies would not create true immortality, but just significantly longer healthy lifespans, living healthily to 150 instead of 75. The philosophical worries about eternal boredom do not apply to merely very long lives. But Williams's argument may apply even to very long lives. If you live to 300, you might exhaust your categorical desires before then. The argument does not require strict immortality, just life long enough that boredom and meaninglessness set in. Where exactly this threshold lies remains unclear. Would 200 years be too long? 500? Perhaps it varies by individual. An underexplored question is whether the desirability of continued life might change over a lifetime. Perhaps in youth and middle age, when you have many goals and relationships, extended life is clearly desirable. But after a very long life, after you have accomplished your major goals and many loved ones have died, you might genuinely be ready to die. Not from depression or defeat, but from completion. You have lived fully, and continuing further would add little. This suggests the ideal might not be immortality or fixed lifespan, but choice. The ability to continue living as long as you find life valuable, but also the ability to choose death when you feel complete. Some call this conditional immortality, immortality with an exit option. You cannot be killed against your will, but you can choose to die when ready. But even conditional immortality faces problems. Choosing death requires confidence that future life would not be valuable. But how can you know this? Perhaps after another century you would discover new sources of meaning. Choosing death forecloses possibilities you cannot foresee. Moreover, the choice itself might be corrupted by social pressure, depression, or temporary despair that would pass if you continued living. The immortality debate also illuminates what we value about life. Is it experiences and pleasures? Then immortality might be good as long as good experiences continue. Is it relationships and connections? Then immortality with loved ones who also live forever might be ideal, but immortality alone would be terrible. Is it achievement and meaning? Then immortality is valuable only if immortal existence allows meaningful achievement. William's argument suggests that what we value is not life per se, but a life structured by finitude. The urgency, intensity and meaning that finitude creates are not incidental features we could preserve in immortal existence. They are essentially connected to mortality. An immortal being who tried to maintain the psychology of a mortal would be self-deceived. Genuine immortality requires a completely different way of existing. Perhaps better, perhaps worse, but certainly different from what we value now. Some philosophers influenced by Buddhism argue that attachment to continued existence is itself the problem. The desire for immortality reflects craving, the source of suffering. The goal should be not extending existence indefinitely, but achieving equanimity about impermanence. This perspective suggests that obsession with avoiding death prevents us from living well. True wisdom means accepting mortality without resistance. Others, influenced by Nietzsche, argue for eternal recurrence as a test of life affirmation. If you would be willing to live your exact life repeatedly for eternity, identical in every detail, then your life is well lived. This is not a metaphysical claim about time being circular, but an evaluative criterion. The question is whether your life is good enough that you would affirm it, even if it repeated eternally without variation. The immortality debate has no resolution, because it depends on empirical questions we cannot answer and value questions that admit multiple responses. We do not know what immortal existence would actually be like psychologically. We do not know whether boredom is inevitable or could be overcome. We do not know whether personal identity could be preserved. And even if we knew these facts, people reasonably disagree about what kind of life is most valuable. What the debate reveals is that our attitude toward death is complicated. We fear death because we love life, but we might also need death to make life valuable. This paradox, that what we value depends on what we fear, suggests that the relationship between mortality and meaning is deeper than we usually recognize. Perhaps the meaning we find in life is not despite its finitude, but because of it. The practical upshot is humility about life extension. We should not assume that living longer is always better or that immortality would be paradise. But neither should we embrace death as good or necessary without serious consideration. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Life is valuable, but perhaps not infinitely valuable. Death is bad, but perhaps not the worst thing. And the ideal lifespan might be neither as short as we currently live, nor as long as immortality, but something in between. Long enough to complete meaningful projects, but not so long that existence becomes unbearable. What Williams and Nagel share is recognition that death poses a genuine philosophical problem. Williams thinks mortality is necessary for meaning. Nagel thinks mortality is always unfortunate. But both agree that the question matters profoundly. How we think about death's value affects how we think about life's meaning, medical priorities, resource allocation, and what kind of future we should build. Whether immortality would be desirable remains uncertain. But the question forces us to clarify what we ultimately value about existence itself. Part 6. Death and Meaning. Does mortality give life significance? One of the most profound questions about death concerns its relationship to meaning. Does the fact that we will die give life significance, or does it drain life of meaning? This question has generated sharply opposed responses. Some argue that only finitude makes things matter. Others argue that finitude undermines genuine significance. The debate reveals fundamental disagreements about what meaning consists in and where it comes from. The finite meaning thesis holds that mortality is not merely compatible with meaningful life, but necessary for it. Without death, life would lose the urgency, intensity, and structure that make meaningful action possible. Consider deadlines. The word itself contains death. We need deadlines because without them we would procrastinate indefinitely. The pressure of limited time forces us to prioritize, to focus, to act. Remove the deadline and motivation dissipates. Life itself has a deadline. We have limited time, and this limitation creates pressure to use time well. If you knew you would live forever, why read this book today rather than in a century? Why have a difficult conversation now rather than postponing it indefinitely? Why pursue any goal with urgency when infinite time remains? The scarcity of time makes time valuable. Each moment matters because there are only finitely many moments. This argument extends beyond mere urgency. Finitude creates narrative structure. A life with a beginning, middle, and end can have dramatic shape. Choices matter because they foreclose other possibilities. You cannot do everything, so what you choose reveals who you are. Commitment becomes meaningful because it involves sacrifice. Loving someone deeply matters because your time together is limited. If you had infinite time to spend with infinite people, each relationship would be diluted. Samuel Scheffler has argued that mortality gives life meaning partly through our connection to future generations. We care about projects that will outlast us. We invest in our children, create art that will endure, contribute to institutions that will continue. These forward-looking projects provide meaning precisely because we will not be there to see their full fruition. We give to a future we will not inhabit. This self-transcending generosity becomes possible only for mortal beings who know they will die. Moreover, mortality creates existential stakes. Your choices matter because they constitute your one life. There is no do-over, no second chance to live differently. The permanence of your choices gives them weight. Make the wrong career choice and you waste years you cannot recover. Damage a relationship and you may never repair it before death intervenes. This high-stakes quality makes life serious in a way it could not be if everything were reversible or repeatable. Death also creates the possibility of tragedy, and tragedy is central to human meaning-making. The fact that good lives can be cut short, that potential can be unrealized, that relationships can be severed by death. These tragic possibilities give life poignancy and depth. A world without tragedy would be a world without real stakes, without genuine loss, without the nobility that comes from facing adversity and mortality with courage. But the opposing view argues that mortality fundamentally undermines meaning rather than creates it. This position has ancient roots. If everything ends in death, if all our accomplishments will eventually be forgotten, if the universe will eventually reach heat death and nothing we do will persist, then nothing really matters. All human endeavor is, in the long run, futile. We build sandcastles that the tide will wash away. This argument has several versions. The strongest focuses on permanence. For something to genuinely matter, it must make a lasting difference. But mortality ensures nothing lasts. You will die, everyone you love will die, humanity will eventually go extinct, the sun will burn out, the universe will reach maximum entropy. From the perspective of eternity, human life is infinitesimally brief, and our accomplishments vanishingly insignificant. How can anything genuinely matter given this cosmic futility? This is sometimes called the futility argument. No matter what you accomplish, death renders it meaningless. You write a great novel. Eventually all copies will decay and no one will remember it. You love your children. Eventually they die too, and your lineage ends. You contribute to human knowledge. Eventually humanity forgets it or goes extinct. Every human project faces the same ultimate fate: oblivion. The response to this argument often distinguishes between objective and subjective meaning. Objective meaning would be meaning built into the fabric of reality, recognized by the universe itself as important. Subjective meaning is meaning for us, significance we create through our projects and values. The futility argument assumes that only objective meaning counts, but perhaps this assumption is wrong. Things can matter to us even if they do not matter cosmically. Your relationship with your child matters profoundly to you and your child, even if it makes no difference to distant galaxies. Your work matters if it contributes to goals you value, even if those goals will eventually be forgotten. Meaning does not require permanence or cosmic significance. It requires engagement with valuable activities and relationships during the time you exist. This response faces the charge of subjectivism. If meaning is purely subjective, merely what we happen to care about, then meaning becomes arbitrary. Serial killers care about murder. Does that make murder meaningful for them? If meaning is just what matters to someone, then anything can be meaningful, and the concept loses normative force. We want to say some lives are genuinely more meaningful than others, some projects truly worthwhile, and others wasteful. Perhaps meaning requires not just subjective engagement, but engagement with objectively valuable activities. Certain things are genuinely worth doing: creating beauty, acquiring knowledge, loving others, reducing suffering. These activities have value independent of whether anyone values them. A meaningful life is one devoted to genuinely valuable pursuits. Mortality does not undermine this, because the activities have value while you engage in them, regardless of what happens after. But this move requires defending objective value, which many philosophers find problematic. Where do objective values come from? Not from God, if you are secular. Not from nature, which is value neutral. Perhaps from human nature or rational reflection. But these foundations are controversial. Without a secure foundation for objective value, the appeal to objective value does not solve the problem. Another response challenges the assumption that permanence matters. Why should lasting forever be necessary for genuine significance? You enjoy a delicious meal. The meal is consumed and gone forever. Does this retroactively make the enjoyment meaningless? You have a wonderful conversation that ends. Does the ending erase the conversation's value? Present value does not depend on future permanence. Something can matter profoundly in the moment without lasting forever. This insight suggests that the futility argument commits a temporal fallacy. It evaluates life's meaning from the perspective of eternity, from outside time. But meaning is experienced within time by temporal beings. From within our temporal existence, things matter. The fact that from an eternal perspective they might not matter is irrelevant because we do not exist from an eternal perspective. Thomas Nagel argues that the absurd quality of life arises from the collision between our limited perspective and our capacity to recognize that limitation. We care intensely about things that we also recognize as ultimately insignificant. We pursue goals while aware that death will render our pursuit futile. This creates absurdity. We cannot help caring about what we also cannot help recognizing as unimportant. Nagel suggests the appropriate response is not despair, but irony. We should live fully committed to our projects while also maintaining awareness of the cosmic unimportance of those projects. This double consciousness allows us to take life seriously enough to live well without taking it so seriously that we become fanatical or crushed when things go wrong. But critics argue this response is psychologically unstable. Can you really fully commit to something while believing it ultimately does not matter? Does not the belief in cosmic insignificance undermine the possibility of genuine commitment? Perhaps Nagel's solution works intellectually but fails psychologically. Most people cannot maintain the double consciousness he recommends. They either lose themselves in their projects, forgetting cosmic insignificance, or become paralyzed by awareness of futility. A different approach focuses on present moment value rather than narrative or legacy. Perhaps meaning comes not from grand projects or lasting accomplishments, but from present experience. A sunset is beautiful now. A moment of connection with another person is meaningful now. The quality of experience in the present moment provides meaning independent of what comes before or after. This Buddhist-influenced perspective suggests we misunderstand meaning when we locate it in lasting accomplishments or future outcomes. Real meaning is found in presence, awareness, and quality of experience. Death does not threaten this because each moment stands on its own. Whether you live 1 day or 1,000,000 years, the quality of present experience provides whatever meaning life has. This view has attractive features, but also limitations. It struggles to explain why we care about goals, projects, and relationships that extend over time. If only present experience matters, why finish writing your book? The present experience of writing later chapters is not better than the present experience of stopping now. But we do care about completion, about seeing projects through, about maintaining commitments over time. Pure present moment focus seems to miss something important about human meaning-making. Perhaps meaning requires both dimensions, present engagement and extended narrative. A meaningful life involves both quality of experience, moment to moment, and pursuit of valuable projects over time. Death threatens the second, but not the first. So mortality partially undermines meaning by preventing completion of long-term projects, but does not entirely undermine meaning because present engagement retains value. Some philosophers argue that meaning requires a relationship to something larger than oneself. Meaning comes from contributing to something that transcends your individual existence, your community, humanity, God, truth, beauty. On this view, purely self-contained lives lack meaning no matter how pleasurable. You need to connect to something beyond yourself to achieve significance. Mortality complicates this picture. If you contribute to something larger than yourself, your contribution may outlast you. The institutions you build, the knowledge you discover, the people you influence, continue after your death. In this sense, mortality does not undermine meaning, but enables a form of transcendence. You live on through your effects on the world, but this response assumes your effects will actually persist. Most people's effects fade quickly. A few generations after your death, you are forgotten. Your contributions are absorbed into the larger stream of history without individual recognition. Does this retroactive anonymity erase the meaning of your contributions? If meaning requires lasting effects, and most people's effects do not last, then most lives are meaningless. This conclusion is hard to accept. It implies that only historically significant people achieve meaning. Famous artists, scientists, political leaders, ordinary people living ordinary lives would lack meaning. But this seems wrong. A parent who raises children with love creates meaning even if history forgets them. A teacher who inspires students creates meaning even if the inspiration fades generations later. Small acts of kindness and creation seem meaningful even without lasting impact. Perhaps the problem is the focus on effects and legacy. Meaning is not about whether you are remembered, but about how you live. A life devoted to valuable pursuits and relationships is meaningful, independent of lasting fame or influence. What matters is not immortality through legacy, but quality of existence while you live. Yet we do seem to care about being remembered and leaving a mark. The thought that we will be completely forgotten is distressing to many people. Why? If meaning comes from how we live rather than whether we are remembered, why does the prospect of oblivion bother us? Perhaps because we implicitly believe that meaning requires some form of permanence, that a life completely erased from memory retroactively loses significance. The relationship between death and meaning may depend on time scale. In the short term, mortality creates urgency and focus. In the medium term, the possibility of death before completion threatens meaning. In the long term, inevitable complete oblivion seems to undermine meaning entirely. Different timescales generate different conclusions about whether mortality supports or undermines significance. Cultural and religious traditions provide different frameworks for addressing these questions. Theistic religions offer literal immortality and cosmic significance through God's perspective. Your life matters eternally because God knows and values it. Death is not the end, but a transition to eternal existence where meaning is preserved. This solution works only for believers and depends on controversial theological claims. Secular existentialists argue we must create meaning through choice and commitment despite the absence of cosmic significance. Sartre claimed we are condemned to freedom. We must choose how to live without ultimate justification. This creates anguish, but also authentic responsibility. We cannot blame God, nature, or society for our choices. We must own them fully. Stoic philosophers recommended accepting mortality as natural and focusing on what we can control. We cannot control when we die, but we can control how we live until death. Meaning comes from living virtuously and rationally according to nature. Death is neither good nor bad, but merely a natural process. Fearing death wastes energy better spent living well. Eastern philosophies often emphasize impermanence as a fundamental feature of reality. Everything arises and passes away. Clinging to permanence causes suffering. Accepting impermanence brings peace. On this view, the relationship between death and meaning is transformed. Meaning does not require permanence. Indeed, grasping after permanence prevents us from appreciating the meaning available in transient existence. Contemporary philosophers have explored whether meaning requires narrative unity. Alasdair MacIntyre argues that human life is intelligible only as a narrative quest. We are characters in unfolding stories, and meaning comes from narrative coherence. Death creates the end point that makes narrative unity possible. A life without end would have no narrative structure, and therefore no narrative meaning. Others argue that narrative unity is overrated. Lives can be meaningful even if episodic and fragmented. Not everyone's life follows a coherent narrative arc. Some lives contain multiple, disconnected phases. Some people reinvent themselves repeatedly. Perhaps narrative unity is one source of meaning, but not necessary for all meaningful lives. The question of whether death undermines or creates meaning has no single answer, because meaning itself is multifaceted. There are different types of meaning: experiential, narrative, relational, achievement-based, cosmic. Death affects these different types differently. It threatens narrative completion and achievement-based meaning, but need not threaten experiential or relational meaning. It eliminates cosmic permanence, but preserves human-scale significance. Your view on death and meaning will depend on which type of meaning you prioritize. If you think meaning requires cosmic significance and permanence, mortality is devastating. If you think meaning comes from present engagement and relationships, mortality is less threatening. If you think meaning requires completing important projects, mortality is conditionally problematic depending on whether you die before completion. Most people probably hold complex, somewhat inconsistent views. We value both present experience and long-term projects, both lasting legacy and transient beauty, both personal relationships and cosmic significance. Mortality threatens some of these values while supporting others. We are pulled in multiple directions because the different sources of meaning we value have different temporal structures. Perhaps the wisest response is acknowledging this complexity. Death poses a genuine threat to meaning in some respects. It prevents completion, ensures eventual oblivion, limits what we can experience and accomplish. But death also creates conditions for meaning in other respects. It generates urgency, enables sacrifice, creates narrative structure, makes choices significant. Living well means navigating these tensions rather than resolving them cleanly. The relationship between death and meaning is ultimately inseparable from questions about what kind of life is worth living. Different conceptions of the good life generate different conclusions about death's significance. A life focused on lasting accomplishments is more threatened by mortality than a life focused on present-moment awareness. A life seeking cosmic significance is more threatened than a life seeking human connection. Your answer to whether death undermines meaning depends on your answer to what makes life meaningful in the first place. Part 7. Philosophical Responses: Stoicism, Acceptance, and the Art of Dying. Beyond analyzing whether death harms us or undermines meaning, philosophy has offered practical wisdom about how to relate to mortality. These traditions aim not at theoretical understanding, but at transforming our emotional and practical relationship with death. The goal is not to prove death is not bad, but to live well despite knowing we will die. Stoicism, one of the most influential ancient philosophical schools, made death central to its practical ethics. The Stoics argued that fearing death is irrational and that proper understanding eliminates this fear. Their approach combined metaphysical claims about the nature of death with practical techniques for managing death anxiety. The Stoic argument begins with a distinction between what is in our control and what is not. Death is not in our control. We cannot ultimately prevent our deaths. Therefore, it is irrational to spend energy fearing or resisting death. We should focus our concern on what we can control, our judgments, values, and responses to circumstances. Death itself is neither good nor bad, but indifferent. What matters is how we face death. Epicurus, a former slave who became a Stoic philosopher, recommended daily meditation on mortality. Each morning, remind yourself that you and everyone you love will die. This is not morbidity, but realism. By constantly maintaining awareness of impermanence, you prepare yourself for loss. When death comes, you are not surprised or overwhelmed. You have already accepted it as inevitable. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, wrote in his private journals about death constantly. He reminded himself that death is natural, that countless millions have died before him, that he is just one more temporary arrangement of matter that will dissolve. This cosmic perspective aimed to make death seem less personally threatening. You are not special. Death happens to everyone, Accept it as part of nature's cycle. The Stoics also emphasized that fearing death wastes the present. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Most of what we fear about death never happens. We imagine terrible scenarios that do not occur. And when death does come, we will not suffer because we will not exist. The fear is present, but the feared thing never arrives as we imagine. So fearing death is doubly irrational. It causes present suffering over a future non-suffering. Stoic techniques for managing death anxiety include negative visualization. Regularly imagine losing what you value: your health, your loved ones, your possessions, your life. This serves multiple functions. It prepares you for loss, so you are not devastated when it occurs. It increases present gratitude by making you aware how easily you could lose everything, and it weakens your attachment to external things beyond your control. But Stoicism faces criticisms. First, is it psychologically realistic to eliminate fear of death through rational reflection? The Stoics believed that emotions follow judgments. If you judge correctly that death is indifferent, fear will disappear. But modern psychology suggests emotions are not so cognitively controllable. You can judge that flying is statistically safe while still feeling terror during turbulence. Knowing intellectually that death is natural does not automatically eliminate fear. Second, is eliminating fear of death even desirable? Fear of death has survival value. It motivates caution, health behavior, risk avoidance. Completely eliminating this fear might lead to recklessness. Perhaps moderate death anxiety is adaptive and healthy, while only extreme death anxiety is problematic. Third, Stoic detachment risks diminishing engagement with life. If you maintain constant awareness that everything is impermanent and will be lost, do you not reduce your capacity to love fully, to commit deeply, to care intensely? The Stoics would deny this. They argued that true love is compatible with accepting impermanence. But critics worry that Stoic equanimity is really a defense mechanism, emotional numbing disguised as wisdom. Fourth, Stoicism works better for privileged people facing natural death than for oppressed people facing violence or injustice. If you are a Roman emperor facing death from illness at the end of a long life, accepting death as natural seems reasonable. If you are a slave facing execution or a child dying from preventable disease, accepting death seems like giving up on justice. The Stoic emphasis on acceptance can become an excuse for not fighting against preventable death. Despite these limitations, Stoicism offers valuable insights. The distinction between what we can and cannot control remains useful. Worrying constantly about eventual death does waste present life. Some degree of acceptance is necessary for psychological health. And the Stoic emphasis on focusing on how we respond to circumstances rather than trying to control circumstances themselves contains profound wisdom. Buddhism approaches death differently, but shares with Stoicism an emphasis on acceptance. Buddhist philosophy teaches that all conditioned things are impermanent. Clinging to permanence causes suffering. Accepting impermanence brings equanimity and peace. Death is not an enemy, but a teacher, revealing the transient nature of all existence. Buddhist practice includes meditation on death and decomposition. In some traditions, practitioners meditate in charnel grounds among corpses, confronting mortality directly. The goal is not to become morbid, but to see through the illusion of permanence. Your body is already in the process of dying. Cells die and are replaced constantly. The boundary between life and death is not sharp, but gradual. This meditation practice aims to weaken the sense of self. Buddhism teaches that clinging to self is the root of suffering. But if you observe carefully, you find no permanent self. What you call yourself is a changing stream of experiences, thoughts, sensations. Death reveals that this stream simply stops. There is no permanent self that dies because there never was a permanent self. Realizing this deeply brings liberation from death anxiety. Buddhism also emphasizes that death is not the opposite of life, but the opposite of birth. Life includes both birth and death as phases. Fearing death while not fearing birth reflects misunderstanding. Both are transitions, temporary arrangements arising and passing. In some Buddhist traditions, there is belief in rebirth, though not in a permanent soul. The stream of consciousness continues in a new form. In other Buddhist traditions, rebirth is understood psychologically. You are reborn moment to moment as each thought arises and passes. The Buddhist approach offers psychological benefits. Studies show that Buddhist practitioners report less death anxiety and more acceptance of mortality. The meditation practices seem to reduce existential fear. The philosophical framework provides a way of making sense of death that reduces its threat. But Buddhism faces its own challenges. First, is the self-denial psychologically healthy? Western psychology emphasizes self-development, self-esteem, healthy sense of identity. Buddhism teaches that the self is an illusion to be transcended. These seem incompatible. Perhaps Buddhist no-self doctrine works in Buddhist cultural contexts but creates problems in individualistic Western cultures. Second, does death acceptance risk passivity? If death is natural and inevitable, why fight disease? Why develop life-saving medicine? Why not simply accept death whenever it comes? Buddhism can respond that reducing suffering is virtuous even if death is inevitable. But the emphasis on acceptance can lead to fatalism. Third, Buddhist claims about rebirth are controversial. If understood literally, they require accepting a metaphysical framework many find implausible. If understood only psychologically, they may lose their power to console. The question is whether Buddhist techniques work without Buddhist metaphysics. Despite these issues, Buddhist practices offer tools for managing death anxiety. Mindfulness meditation reduces rumination and worry about future death. Loving-kindness practice strengthens connection with others, reducing isolation in facing mortality. Contemplation of impermanence can increase present-moment appreciation. These techniques can be adapted even by non-Buddhists seeking healthier relationships with mortality. Epicurean philosophy offers yet another approach. As discussed earlier, Epicurus argued that death cannot harm us because we do not exist to experience it. But he went further, offering a complete philosophy of how to live without death anxiety. The goal was ataraxia, tranquility, peace of mind, freedom from disturbance. Epicurus taught that we should focus on simple pleasures available to everyone: friendship, thought, simple food. Elaborate pleasure-seeking creates dependence and anxiety. You worry about losing what you have acquired. You constantly desire more. This generates unhappiness. Simple pleasures are more reliable, less anxiety-producing, and ultimately more satisfying. Death anxiety, according to Epicurus, stems from false beliefs. Correct these beliefs and the anxiety disappears. Death is nothing to us. There is no afterlife to fear. The gods do not punish humans. When you understand these truths, you can live in tranquility without worrying about death. The Epicurean approach emphasizes that death anxiety is learned and cultural. Children do not fear death until taught to fear it by culture. Remove the false beliefs culture instills, religious fears of punishment, supernatural terrors, and natural fearlessness returns. We are born without death anxiety. We can return to that state through philosophical understanding. Critics argue Epicurus oversimplifies. Death anxiety may have evolutionary roots deeper than cultural conditioning. We are biologically programmed to fear death because this promotes survival. Philosophical argument cannot simply override biological instinct. Moreover, even if Epicurus is logically correct that death cannot harm us, logic does not automatically change emotional responses. Nonetheless, Epicurean insights remain valuable. Much death anxiety does stem from culturally instilled fears that philosophical reflection can address. Religious fears of hellfire can be eliminated by recognizing they lack evidence. Fear of missing out on future experiences can be reduced by focusing on present satisfaction. Epicurus offers a naturalistic alternative to religious frameworks for managing mortality. Contemporary philosophy has explored whether acceptance of death is always appropriate. Some argue that death is genuinely bad, and we should not pretend otherwise. Acceptance of unjust premature death seems morally wrong. If a child dies from preventable disease, the proper response is not stoic acceptance, but anger and determination to prevent such deaths. Death acceptance works only for natural deaths at the end of long lives, not for deaths that could and should be prevented. This raises questions about medical ethics. Should doctors encourage acceptance of death for terminal patients? Or should they always fight for more life? The answer likely depends on circumstances. When further treatment offers no benefit and only prolongs suffering, acceptance seems appropriate. When effective treatments exist, fighting for life makes sense. The art is knowing which situation you face. Palliative care medicine has developed an approach of honest acknowledgement without false hope. Doctors tell patients the truth about prognosis while offering comfort care. The goal is neither fighting death to the bitter end nor giving up too soon, but realistic assessment of what is possible and focus on quality of remaining life rather than mere duration. The concept of a good death has re-emerged in contemporary discussions. Different cultures have different ideals. Some emphasize dying at home, surrounded by family. Some emphasize dying peacefully without pain. Some emphasize dying with dignity and autonomy. Some emphasize dying in harmony with nature or God's will. These ideals shape how people prepare for death and what medical choices they make. Philosophy can contribute by clarifying what makes death good or bad beyond mere timing. A death can be better or worse, depending on how it occurs. Dying peacefully in your sleep differs from dying in agony. Dying surrounded by loved ones differs from dying alone. Dying with acceptance differs from dying in terror. These qualitative differences matter independently of when death occurs. The art of dying, practiced in medieval and early modern Europe, involved learning to die well. People studied texts on preparing for death, practiced imagining their deaths, made elaborate preparations. This may seem morbid to modern sensibilities, but it reflected recognition that death is important enough to prepare for. We spend years preparing for careers that last decades. Why not spend some time preparing for death that lasts forever? Modern culture largely abandoned the art of dying. Death became medicalized, hidden, denied. We die in hospitals away from families. Death is treated as medical failure rather than natural completion. This cultural shift has costs. People face death unprepared, terrified, without frameworks for making sense of mortality. Some philosophers advocate reviving practices of death preparation. This does not mean morbid obsession, but realistic acknowledgement. Make advanced directives specifying what medical treatment you want. Have conversations with loved ones about death and grief. Reflect on what gives your life meaning and whether you are living accordingly. Consider what you want your legacy to be. These practical preparations reduce anxiety and improve end-of-life experience. The relationship between death and virtue is another area of philosophical reflection. Many traditions claim that awareness of mortality promotes virtue. Knowing you will die encourages living authentically, treating others well, focusing on what matters. If you believed you would live forever, you might postpone moral seriousness indefinitely. But skeptics question whether mortality really promotes virtue. Does death anxiety not also promote vice? Selfishness, aggression, exploitation? Terror management theory suggests that death anxiety increases prejudice and violence. Perhaps mortality's effect on virtue depends on how death awareness is processed. Reflective acceptance of mortality might promote virtue, while unconscious death terror promotes vice. The practice of memento mori, remember you must die, aims to use mortality awareness constructively. Medieval monks kept skulls in their cells as reminders of death. This was not morbidity, but motivation for spiritual seriousness. If your time is limited, waste not a moment. Live as if each day might be your last. This generates both urgency and appreciation, but memento mori can become oppressive if practiced obsessively. Some people respond to constant death reminders not with motivation, but with paralysis and depression. The practice works for some personality types and cultural contexts, but not universally. Wisdom means knowing how much death awareness is optimal for you specifically. Different life stages may require different relationships with mortality. Young people need some death awareness to avoid reckless behavior, but not so much that they fail to plan for long lives. Middle-aged people need death awareness to motivate completion of important projects before it is too late. Elderly people need death acceptance to face the final stage without terror. The appropriate relationship with mortality shifts as life unfolds. Philosophy's contribution is providing multiple frameworks for relating to mortality. Stoicism offers acceptance based on reason and nature. Buddhism offers acceptance based on impermanence and no self. Epicureanism offers tranquility based on logical argument. Contemporary approaches offer integration of these traditions with modern psychology and medicine. No single approach works for everyone. Different people in different circumstances need different tools. What these traditions share is the recognition that death is inevitable, but terror about death is not. While we cannot eliminate death, we can change how we relate to it. This is philosophy's practical promise, not solving the problem of death, but transforming our experience of living as mortals. The goal is not fearlessness, but appropriate fear, not denial, but realistic acknowledgement, not obsession, but balanced awareness. Part 8. Contemporary Frontiers, Life Extension, Digital Immortality and Technological Transcendence. For most of human history, death was an unchangeable fact. Philosophy could only help us accept what could not be altered. But modern science has raised the possibility of radically extending lifespan or even achieving functional immortality. This transforms the philosophical question. We must now ask not only how to live with mortality, but whether we should attempt to overcome it. Life extension research pursues multiple strategies. Some focus on slowing aging through understanding cellular mechanisms. Telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes, shorten with each cell division. When they become too short, cells stop dividing and tissues age. Can we lengthen telomeres and slow aging? Research suggests maybe, though risks include increased cancer rates. Other approaches target senescent cells, cells that stop dividing but do not die. They accumulate with age and secrete harmful substances. Drugs called senolytics can eliminate these cells. Early research in mice shows promising results. Treated mice live longer and healthier lives. Human trials are beginning. Caloric restriction consistently extends lifespan in laboratory animals. Rats eating 30% fewer calories live significantly longer. The mechanism involves metabolic changes that slow aging. But extreme caloric restriction is unpleasant for humans and may have costs. Research now focuses on drugs that mimic caloric restriction's benefits without requiring constant hunger. Some researchers pursue more radical approaches. Aubrey de Grey argues aging is a disease that can be cured. He proposes strategies for engineered negligible senescence, maintaining the body indefinitely through periodic interventions that repair accumulated damage. His approach includes removing senescent cells, breaking down metabolic waste products, replacing lost cells through stem cell therapy and other interventions. Critics argue de Grey overpromises. Aging is not a single disease, but multiple interconnected processes. Solving one problem often creates others. Cancer and aging are inversely related. Mechanisms that prevent cancer often accelerate aging, and vice versa. Complete victory over aging may be impossible because biology faces inherent trade-offs. But even partial success would matter. If we could slow aging enough that healthy lifespan extends to 150 or 200 years, this would transform human existence. Many philosophers' arguments about death assume lifespan roughly as it is now, 70 to 90 years. What if that changed dramatically? Radical life extension raises profound ethical questions. First, distributive justice. Life extension technologies will be expensive initially. Only the wealthy could afford them. This would create unprecedented inequality. The rich living centuries while the poor die young. This seems morally intolerable. But if we wait until life extension is affordable for everyone, we let people die who could have been saved. Is that better or worse? Second, population and resources. If people live twice as long, population could double even with reduced birth rates. Earth's resources are already strained. Can we support a population living much longer? Perhaps life extension requires also reducing births. But should we tell people they cannot have children so their grandparents can live longer? This creates intergenerational conflict. Third, social stagnation. People accumulate power, wealth, and position over time. If people live centuries, inequality would compound. Powerful people would remain powerful indefinitely. New generations would face permanently blocked opportunities. Innovation and social change depend partly on generational turnover. Radical life extension might freeze society. Defenders respond that these are problems to solve, not reasons to reject life extension entirely. We should pursue life extension while also pursuing fairer distribution, sustainable population, and social structures that prevent stagnation. Do not let people die to solve social problems. Fix the social problems. Moreover, life extension is not all or nothing. Even modest extensions, adding healthy years to average lifespan, would be valuable. We need not achieve immortality to benefit from aging research. Compression of morbidity, remaining healthy until shortly before death, would improve billions of lives even without extending maximum lifespan. The philosophical question is whether extremely long life would be desirable for individuals. We discussed Williams's argument that immortality would eventually become boring. But does this apply to lives of 200 years? Perhaps 200 years is long enough to achieve major goals, but not so long that boredom sets in. There may be a sweet spot, longer than our current lifespan, but shorter than eternity. Digital immortality offers a different approach. Rather than extending biological life, perhaps we could upload consciousness to computers. Your brain could be scanned in perfect detail, the scan could be instantiated in a computer simulation, and the simulation would be you. Same memories, personality, values. Your biological body dies, but you continue existing digitally, potentially forever. This prospect raises immediate philosophical questions. Would the upload really be you, or would it be a copy while you die? This is the classic problem of personal identity applied to technology. What matters for survival? Physical continuity? Psychological continuity? Something else? Some argue physical continuity matters. You are essentially your biological body. A perfect copy is still just a copy. When your brain is scanned and uploaded, you die. The upload is someone else, however similar. This seems to respect the intuition that your existence is tied to this specific body. But this faces objections. First, your body is not permanent. Cells are constantly replaced. The atoms in your body now are mostly different from atoms in your body 7 years ago. Yet you survived. You are not identical with any specific arrangement of matter. Second, we accept cases where psychological continuity preserves identity despite physical discontinuity. If your brain were transplanted to another body, you would survive. What matters is psychological continuity, not physical continuity. Others argue the upload would be you if the process preserves psychological continuity. The upload has your memories, personality, dispositions. From its perspective, it is continuously you. The fact that the substrate changed from biological neurons to digital circuits does not matter. What makes you you is the pattern, not the physical substance instantiating the pattern. But this faces its own problems. Suppose the upload process does not destroy the biological brain. You are scanned but remain alive. Now, there are two beings with your memories and personality, biological you and digital you. They are both you? That seems incoherent. They are two different people. Then which is the real you? The situation seems metaphysically confused. Perhaps the solution is gradual replacement. Imagine replacing neurons one at a time with functionally equivalent artificial neurons. At each step, you remain conscious in yourself. Eventually, your entire brain is artificial, but you have been continuously conscious throughout. This seems to preserve identity better than instant uploading. But even gradual replacement faces puzzles. At what point do you cease being the original biological person? After the first artificial neuron? After 51% artificial? These questions have no obvious answers. Personal identity seems to resist sharp boundaries, yet artificial replacement seems to require sharp boundaries. Another problem with digital immortality is whether digital consciousness is possible. Can a computer simulation really be conscious? Or would it be a philosophical zombie, behaviorally identical to a conscious being but lacking inner experience? We do not understand consciousness well enough to be confident about whether it could be instantiated digitally. Pessimists about artificial consciousness argue that consciousness depends on specific biological properties of neurons that cannot be replicated in silicon. Perhaps quantum processes in microtubules are necessary for consciousness. Perhaps consciousness requires the specific biochemistry of biological brains. If so, digital uploads would not be conscious, just complex programs mimicking consciousness. Optimists argue that consciousness depends on functional organization, not specific physical implementation. If a digital system replicates the functional organization of a brain, it would be conscious. Substrate does not matter. Only the pattern of information processing matters. This view finds support in functionalist theories of mind, but remains controversial. Even if digital consciousness is possible, would digital immortality be desirable? Consider the environment. You exist in a simulated world. This world could be anything programmers design, paradise or prison. You depend completely on whoever controls the computer running your simulation. They could shut you off, modify you, torture you digitally. Digital existence offers no guarantees of good experience. Moreover, digital immortality still faces Williams's boredom argument. Even if you exist digitally, you face infinite time. Would digital existence be any better than biological immortality in avoiding eventual boredom? Perhaps a digital environment could provide more novelty through constant updates and expansions, but fundamental limits might remain. Some transhumanists argue we should pursue enhancement, not just life extension. Rather than staying biologically human just longer, we should become something better than human, post-human. We could enhance intelligence through genetic engineering or brain-computer interfaces. We could eliminate suffering through mood regulation technology. We could expand our perceptual and cognitive capacities beyond biological limits. This raises questions about whether enhanced beings would still be us. If your intelligence is increased tenfold through artificial enhancements, are you still you? Or have you become someone else? The same identity problems arise as with uploading. Additionally, enhancement raises questions about human nature and authenticity. Is there something valuable about being human as we are? Or should we embrace transformation into something new? Enhancement also raises justice concerns. If some people are enhanced while others are not, inequality would explode. Enhanced humans would dominate unenhanced humans. Perhaps we should enhance everyone or no one, but mandatory enhancement violates autonomy. If enhancement is optional, the enhanced will outcompete the unenhanced, effectively forcing everyone to enhance or be left behind. Some philosophers argue for morphological freedom, the right to modify your own body and mind as you choose. If someone wants to enhance their intelligence or upload to digital substrate, we should not prevent them. Their body is theirs to modify. But unlimited morphological freedom creates problems. What if someone wants to modify themselves into something dangerous? What if enhancements create unfair advantages in competition? The ethical frameworks for evaluating these technologies remain underdeveloped. Traditional medical ethics focuses on healing disease and relieving suffering, but life extension and enhancement go beyond healing to improving the human condition. Should we use the same ethical principles or develop new frameworks? Some argue we should embrace the precautionary principle, proceed cautiously with technologies whose consequences are uncertain. Life extension and digital immortality have unpredictable effects. Better to move slowly, study consequences, and proceed carefully. Others argue that caution has costs. Every year we delay life extension. Millions die who could have been saved. Excessive caution lets perfect be the enemy of good. The philosophical questions about technological mortality transcendence are versions of ancient questions updated for new circumstances. What is personal identity? What makes life valuable? What are the limits of human nature? What do we owe future generations? What makes death bad? Technology forces us to confront these questions not merely theoretically but practically, because our answers will determine what technologies we pursue. Some philosophers advocate a conservative approach. Humans evolved for roughly 70-year lifespans. Radically extending this might create psychological problems we cannot anticipate. Moreover, death serves important functions, creating urgency, allowing generational turnover, limiting accumulation of power. Perhaps we should accept biological limits rather than trying to transcend them. Others argue this is status quo bias. Just because humans have always been mortal does not mean mortality is good. If we can reduce suffering and extend flourishing through technology, we should. Accepting death because it is natural commits the naturalistic fallacy. Many natural things are bad: disease, pain, death. We rightly use technology to overcome them. The debate reflects deeper disagreements about human nature and progress. Some see human nature as fixed and valuable, something to preserve rather than transform. Others see human nature as malleable and improvable, something to enhance rather than accept. Some view technological solutions to mortality with skepticism, others with hope. Regardless of philosophical debate, research continues. Scientists worldwide pursue life extension. Technology companies invest in anti-aging research. The question is not whether we will try to extend lifespan, but how far we will succeed and what consequences will follow. Philosophy can inform these developments by clarifying concepts, identifying ethical issues, and helping us think carefully about what we truly value. The prospect of defeating death through technology reveals that our relationship with mortality is not purely philosophical, but also practical. For most of history, accepting death was the only option. Now we face choices. Should we pursue life extension? How much? For whom? At what cost? These are not purely technical questions, but deeply philosophical ones about what makes life valuable and what kind of future we want to create. Part 9. Living in the Shadow. Practical arguments about how to die and how to live. After exploring arguments about whether death harms us, whether it undermines meaning, whether we should fear it, whether we should pursue immortality, we face the ultimate question. How should we actually live, given that we will die? This is where philosophy becomes most practical. Theory must inform practice. Abstract arguments must guide concrete choices. The first practical question is how much to think about death. We have seen arguments that death awareness can be liberating or paralyzing, motivating or depressing. The ancient advice of memento mori tells us to remember death constantly. But modern psychology warns that excessive death anxiety causes problems. Where is the balance? The answer likely varies by person and circumstance. Some personality types benefit from regular death contemplation. They become more focused, more grateful, more authentic when aware of mortality. Others become anxious and avoidant. They function better when not dwelling on death. Self-knowledge matters. You need to understand what level of death awareness helps you live well. For most people, the answer is probably neither constant preoccupation nor complete denial, but something between. Occasional reflection on mortality can provide benefits. Recalibrating priorities, appreciating what you have, motivating action on important projects. But constant dwelling on death prevents engagement with life. The goal is enough awareness to motivate without so much that it paralyzes. Certain life transitions naturally prompt death awareness. Serious illness, loss of loved ones, milestone birthdays, children leaving home. These moments break through everyday denial and force confrontation with mortality. Philosophy suggests using these moments constructively. Rather than pushing thoughts away immediately, sit with them. Ask what they reveal about your values and priorities. Use mortality awareness as catalyst for change. The second practical question concerns how to spend limited time. If your time is finite, what should you do with it? Different philosophical traditions offer different answers. Utilitarianism suggests maximizing total welfare. Do whatever creates the most happiness for the most people. Virtue ethics suggests developing excellent character. Existentialism suggests living authentically according to your own chosen values. Buddhism suggests reducing suffering and cultivating compassion. These frameworks lead to different practical advice. Utilitarianism might recommend effective altruism, using your resources to help the greatest number as efficiently as possible. Virtue ethics might recommend finding a meaningful career, cultivating relationships, and developing wisdom and courage. Existentialism might recommend questioning social expectations and making unconventional choices that express your authentic self. Buddhism might recommend meditation, simplicity, and service to others. No philosophical framework has definitively won this debate. Perhaps different frameworks suit different people. Or perhaps a pluralistic approach is best, incorporating insights from multiple traditions. What matters is having some framework rather than drifting without reflection. Mortality makes time precious. Do not waste it living unreflectively. One practical insight that emerges from mortality awareness is the importance of relationships. When people face death, their own or others, relationships become central. Philosophical debates about meaning and value often abstract from this, but lived experience suggests that love and connection provide life's deepest meaning. If you had 1 year to live, you would likely spend it with people you love, not accumulating achievements or defending philosophical positions. This suggests relationships should be prioritized in life, not deferred until some imagined future when other concerns are resolved. We tend to postpone emotional intimacy. I will be more present with my children when work calms down. I will reconnect with old friends when I have more time. I will tell people I love them when the moment is right. But work never calms down, time never opens up, and the right moment never comes. Death is always possible. Live as if this might be the last chance to connect with people who matter. Another practical implication is the importance of completing things that matter. We discussed philosophical debates about whether unfinished projects are bad. At the practical level, unfinished important projects create regret. Dying with a book half written, a relationship unrepaired, a trip not taken. These incompletions haunt people facing death. Therefore, identify what is truly important and work toward completion rather than endless deferral. This does not mean frantically trying to do everything. Part of wisdom is accepting that most possibilities will remain unrealized. You cannot do everything, travel everywhere, read every book, learn every skill. Making peace with limitation is essential. But within those limitations, focus on what you most care about. Do not let trivialities consume time that could go to what matters most. The phenomenon of deathbed regrets provides data about what people actually value. Studies of dying patients reveal common regrets. Working too much, not expressing feelings, losing touch with friends, not living authentically, not allowing themselves to be happy. These regrets suggest that common life patterns involve prioritizing wrong things. We sacrifice relationships for career advancement, suppress emotions for social approval, lose friendships through neglect, conform rather than risk authenticity, defer happiness waiting for better circumstances. Philosophy suggests reversing these patterns. Work enough to meet your needs, but not so much that work consumes life. Express feelings even when difficult. People regret words unsaid more than words said. Maintain friendships actively. They do not survive on their own. Live according to your values, even when this means diverging from social expectations. Allow yourself to be happy now, rather than waiting for conditions that may never arrive. But this advice faces challenges. Economic realities often force people to work far more than they want. Social norms punish authentic self-expression. Maintaining friendships requires time people lack. Living according to your own values is hard when you're embedded in systems that punish deviance. The advice to live without regrets assumes freedoms many people lack. Philosophy must acknowledge these constraints while still offering guidance. Even within constraints, choices exist. How you respond to limited options matters. The Stoics emphasized that external circumstances are not fully in your control, but your judgments and responses are. Even in difficult circumstances, you can choose your attitude, focus on what you can influence, and maintain integrity. The question of when to die becomes relevant for people facing terminal illness or extreme old age. Modern medicine can extend life almost indefinitely through aggressive intervention, but extension is not always beneficial. Some people reach a point where continued life contains more suffering than value. Should they choose to die? Different ethical and religious frameworks give different answers. Some religions forbid suicide under all circumstances. Life is sacred and only God can decide when it ends. Other traditions allow self-willed death in extreme circumstances. Stoics and Buddhists accepted rational suicide when life became unbearable. Contemporary medical ethics increasingly accepts patient autonomy. Competent adults should be able to refuse treatment, even if this leads to death. The debate over assisted death continues. Some jurisdictions allow terminally ill patients to receive medical assistance in dying. They can receive prescriptions for lethal drugs they self-administer when ready. Other jurisdictions prohibit this, forcing people to continue living even when life has become unbearable. Arguments on both sides involve concerns about autonomy, suffering, the sanctity of life, and potential for abuse. Philosophically, the case for allowing assisted death rests on autonomy and relief of suffering. If someone rationally judges their life no longer worth living and faces terminal illness with significant suffering, forcing them to continue seems cruel. They should be able to exit on their terms. The case against assisted death worries about pressure on vulnerable people, medical complicity in killing, erosion of life's value, and diagnostic uncertainty. Most people hope to die peacefully in their sleep at the end of a long, healthy life. But modern medicine makes this unlikely. More commonly, people face gradual decline with periods of crisis, repeated hospitalizations, and eventual death in intensive care. Philosophy cannot change these facts, but can help us think through what we want and advocate for ourselves. Advanced directives allow you to specify what medical treatment you want if you become unable to communicate. Do you want aggressive resuscitation, artificial ventilation, tube feeding? These are difficult questions with no universal right answers. But thinking them through while healthy allows you to make choices consistent with your values rather than having others decide in crisis. The question of legacy connects to death's meaning. What do you want to leave behind? Some people focus on children and grandchildren, their genetic and familial legacy. Others focus on creative works, art, writing, inventions. Others focus on institutions, organizations they built or contributed to. Others focus on impacts on individuals, people they helped or inspired. Philosophy suggests that legacy matters less than we think. The desire to be remembered reflects anxiety about mortality. We want immortality through lasting influence, since literal immortality is impossible. But actually, being remembered is not necessary for a life to be meaningful. The value of your life consists in how you lived it, not whether others remember you afterward. Moreover, even famous people are eventually forgotten. A few hundred years after your death, no one remembers you. The universe will eventually reach heat death, and nothing anyone did will persist. From this cosmic perspective, obsession with legacy seems misguided. Better to focus on living well than on being remembered. But legacy need not be about fame. Contributing to others' flourishing matters even if you are not remembered. The teacher who inspires students, the parent who raises children with love, the friend who supports others through difficulty, all create value even if they are forgotten. Legacy is about impact, not recognition. The question of whether to have children is partly about how we relate to mortality. Children offer a form of continuation, your genes, your values, your influence persisting after you die. But is this a good reason to have children? Having children to achieve immortality uses them instrumentally. Children should be valued for themselves, not as vehicles for parental legacy. Yet the connection between mortality and children cannot be entirely severed. Our status as mortal, temporary beings who will be replaced by new generations shapes how we think about children. We invest in children partly because we will not be here forever, and they represent the future. This need not be exploitative if we genuinely value children's flourishing for their own sake. The practical question of grief deserves attention. How should we respond to others' deaths? Philosophy has traditionally focused on our own mortality more than others' deaths. But for most people, the deaths of loved ones are more immediate and painful than contemplating their own deaths. Grief is the price we pay for love. The deeper the connection, the more devastating the loss. Some philosophical traditions suggest we should not grieve intensely because death is natural and inevitable. Stoics recommended accepting loss without excessive emotion. But this seems psychologically unrealistic and perhaps morally wrong. Grief honors the relationship. Refusing to grieve fully suggests the relationship did not matter sufficiently. Modern psychology recognizes grief as a process requiring time. You cannot simply decide to stop grieving through philosophical reflection. The pain gradually diminishes, but may never entirely disappear. Philosophy can help by providing frameworks for making sense of loss, but it cannot eliminate grief's pain. One insight philosophy offers is that grief reflects love. You grieve because the relationship mattered profoundly. In this sense, grief is not purely negative, but contains acknowledgement of the relationship's value. Attempting to avoid grief by avoiding deep attachment is self-defeating. Better to love fully and grieve fully than to live without deep connection. The integration of death awareness into everyday life remains challenging. We know intellectually that we will die, but we do not live with this knowledge emotionally present. This is partly healthy. Constant death awareness would prevent normal functioning, but complete denial prevents us from living wisely. How do we achieve balance? Perhaps through rituals and practices that periodically bring death into awareness. Visiting graves, attending funerals, marking anniversaries of deaths, reading obituaries. These practices remind us of mortality without overwhelming us. Some traditions incorporate death awareness into daily practice. Buddhist death meditations, Christian prayers for the dying, Jewish practices of mourning. Modern secular culture lacks robust death rituals. Funerals are often abbreviated and sanitized. We speak of the deceased passing rather than dying. Bodies are whisked away to funeral homes rather than prepared at home. This sanitization of death may prevent us from developing healthy relationships with mortality. Some philosophers advocate for death positivity, confronting death openly rather than treating it as taboo. Discuss death with children, visit dying relatives, talk about your wishes for your own death. Make death a normal topic of conversation rather than something mentioned only in whispers. This cultural shift would help people develop healthier relationships with mortality. The question of purpose becomes urgent when facing mortality. If life is temporary, what purpose does it serve? Religious frameworks offer clear answers. Life's purpose is serving God, preparing for afterlife, fulfilling divine plan. Secular frameworks struggle more. Without cosmic purpose, where does meaning come from? One secular answer is that we create purpose through our choices and values. Life has no inherent purpose, but we give it purpose by committing to projects and relationships we find valuable. This places tremendous responsibility on individuals, but also grants freedom. You are not constrained by externally imposed purposes, but can create meaning through your own commitments. Another answer focuses on well-being. Life's purpose is flourishing, experiencing pleasure, avoiding suffering, developing virtues, forming connections, pursuing knowledge, creating beauty. This grounds purpose in human nature rather than individual choice. We flourish when we actualize our distinctively human capacities. Yet another answer emphasizes contribution. Life's purpose is making the world better for others. Through work, family, community involvement, political engagement, or creative contribution, we improve others' lives. This purpose survives our deaths because the improvements persist. These purposes are not mutually exclusive. A fulfilling life might involve all three: creating personal meaning through choice, flourishing through actualizing your nature, and contributing to others' well-being. The key is having some sense of purpose rather than drifting without direction. Mortality makes purpose urgent because time is limited. The final practical question is how to actually die when the time comes. Most of us hope to die peacefully, surrounded by loved ones without excessive suffering. But hoping is not planning. Dying well requires some preparation. This does not mean dwelling on death obsessively, but addressing practical matters so you can face death with less anxiety. Practical preparation includes obvious things: making a will, appointing someone to make medical decisions if you cannot, discussing your wishes with family, perhaps planning your funeral. These tasks are unpleasant but necessary. Avoiding them leaves burdens for others and increases the likelihood of dying in ways you would not choose. But dying well also requires psychological and spiritual preparation. This means making peace with your life, accepting your choices, forgiving yourself and others, completing important relationships, addressing unfinished emotional business. People who do this work while healthy face death with less regret and fear. Those who avoid it until death is imminent often struggle. Philosophy's ultimate practical contribution is helping us think clearly about what matters. The examined life is worth living, Socrates claimed, because reflection allows us to live according to our deepest values rather than drifting through conventions. Mortality makes this examination urgent. You have limited time. Spend it wisely. The arguments about death we have explored, Epicurean challenges, deprivation accounts, Heideggerian authenticity, terror management, temporal asymmetries, immortality debates, meaning questions, all ultimately serve this practical purpose. They help us think more clearly about how to live. The philosophical value lies not in reaching definitive conclusions, but in the process of careful reflection itself. Living well as mortal beings requires balance. Enough death awareness to motivate and focus, but not so much that we become paralyzed. Enough acceptance of mortality to avoid constant anxiety, but not so much that we become passive. Enough concern with legacy to motivate contribution, but not so much that we sacrifice present relationships for future memory. Enough engagement with life's possibilities to live fully, but enough recognition of limits to make peace with what will remain unrealized. No formula captures this balance. Each person must find it through their own reflection and experimentation. Philosophy provides tools, concepts, arguments, frameworks, but you must apply them to your particular life. The goal is not philosophical mastery, but practical wisdom, knowing how to live well in the shadow of death. The final truth is paradoxical. Death makes life precious precisely by limiting it. The urgency, intensity, and meaning that finitude creates are not unfortunate features we must accept despite our mortality. They are gifts that mortality bestows. An infinite life might lack these qualities. A finite life contains them necessarily. This does not mean death is good. Death is still loss, still deprivation, still something we rationally fear and resist. But it means that death is not purely negative. It shapes the conditions that make life valuable. To be human is to be mortal. We cannot understand ourselves without understanding our relationship to death. and we cannot live well without coming to terms with our mortality. The arguments about death continue. Philosophers will debate these questions as long as philosophy exists. But beyond philosophical debate lies practical living. You will die, so will everyone you love. The universe does not care about your existence. Your time is radically limited. These are hard facts, but they are also the facts that make your life urgently, intensely, preciously yours. What you do with this knowledge is philosophy's ultimate question, and only you can answer it through the choices you make each day.